In the fall of 2003, two detectives were in the middle of a year-long homicide case involving the brutal murder of a 19-year-old girl. And for the first time, they finally felt like they had a viable suspect. However, when they pulled up to this suspect's house to conduct a second interview, the detectives quickly realized the house was abandoned and their suspect had just disappeared. And when they tried to track the suspect down, they discovered something totally bizarre that would turn their case on its head. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please bring the follow button to a fancy art auction, and then when the bidding gets absurdly high, shock them with a taser so they wave their paddle by accident, thereby placing a bid, forcing them to buy a painting they can't afford. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 18, 2002, 19-year-old Allie Kemp walked through the gate at the local pool where she worked in Leawood, Kansas, and headed towards a deck chair. Allie had on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and she had a backpack slung over her shoulder. She also had a huge smile on her face because her boyfriend, Phil Howes, was sitting in the chair that she was approaching. Phil stood up, Allie threw her arms around his neck, and they kissed. Normally, they wouldn't do this at the place where they both worked, but it was a gray, cloudy day and nobody was swimming and there was no other employees on site. Allie had only been back home in the wealthy Kansas City suburb where she grew up for a few weeks after finishing her freshman year at Kansas State University. And almost as soon as her summer break had started, she reconnected with her high school boyfriend, Phil. They had actually mutually agreed to break up before they went off to different colleges, but now that they were back together, Allie felt like no time had passed at all. And it was nice that they even had the same summer job as pool attendants, so they got to see each other at work sometimes. Allie asked if anybody had come to the small neighborhood pool that day, and Phil told her it had been empty except for the landscaping crew, and he thought maybe the pool maintenance worker was coming by later. Phil grabbed his bag and told Allie he would pick her up that night for their dinner date they had planned, then they kissed again, and Phil walked out to the parking lot. After Phil was gone, Allie tossed her backpack on the ground and sat down in the deck chair. She stared out across the empty pool and saw the landscaping crew trimming some trees on the other side of a low fence. They looked her way and smiled. Allie smiled back, but she kind of shrunk down in her chair at the same time. Being alone at the pool near a group of men she didn't know made her feel sort of uncomfortable. But the landscaping crew quickly seemed to forget about her and get back to their work, and Allie sort of forgot about them. Since there was literally nobody at the pool, Allie decided she would do something for herself. She opened up her backpack and pulled out a few brochures for different educational opportunities she had for her upcoming sophomore year. At college, Allie got really good grades, she was a student athlete, and was involved in multiple university clubs. In fact, she had been such an exemplary freshman at Kansas State that she had been invited by the U.S. State Department to join a group of 60 students from across the country who would study abroad and learn about diplomacy and American foreign policy. Allie knew it was a huge deal that she'd been asked to join this program, and she would have immediately jumped at the chance, but she also had another great offer. Her church group had asked her to join them on a study abroad trip to Russia, where she would work directly with young people in need, which was something she thought was extremely important. Both opportunities sounded incredible. Allie still couldn't make up her mind on which one she wanted to take, but either way, she knew she wanted to travel and experience other cultures. Allie had loved growing up in Leawood, and she enjoyed going to college not too far away, but she was ready to get out of Kansas for a while to see what the rest of the world had to offer. Around 3 p.m., an hour after Allie had gotten to the pool, there still wasn't anybody swimming. So she grabbed her backpack, stood up, and walked around the pool to a small table that was set up on the deck for employees. Once she was there, she pulled out her phone and called her boyfriend Phil. But he didn't answer. So she left a message and said she was looking forward to their date that night. Allie checked the time on her phone and sighed. Her younger brother, who also worked at this pool as an attendant, had told her he would come by a bit earlier to take over so she could go home and get ready for her date, but that was still almost 2 hours away. She grabbed a book out of her backpack and started to read, but she didn't feel right doing that on the job. So she decided to do a little work to pass the time. Allie got up, leaving her stuff on the table, and headed to the pump room, which housed pumps, filters, and other equipment to keep the pool clean. She was just about to start organizing the supply shelves when she heard a voice out by the pool. She thought maybe somebody had finally come to swim. Allie called to the person and said she'd be out in just a second. About 2 hours later, at 5 p.m., Allie's younger brother opened the gate to the pool, expecting to see his sister. But the pool was completely empty. He called out for Allie, but she didn't respond. He walked to the restrooms, knocked on the doors, and called for her again, but there still wasn't any reply. This was really weird. His big sister would never just duck out of her shift early. He waited for a little while, thinking maybe Allie had just run across the street for some food or something, but when another several minutes passed and Allie still didn't show up, he started to feel a bit worried. Allie's brother grabbed his phone and called his sister, but Allie didn't answer. And so he dialed another number, his father's number, and when his dad heard what was going on, he said he'd be right over. At 5:25 p.m., Allie's dad, Roger Kemp, arrived at the pool. He met Allie's brother just inside the gate, and he told his son to stay right there. Roger shouted for Allie over and over as he searched the area surrounding the pool, but Allie never called back. And when Roger saw Allie's phone, backpack, and book on the deck table, he was at a complete loss. It seemed like his daughter had just disappeared. He looked around for a little while longer, and as he did, he noticed the open door that led to the pump room. Roger walked through the door into that room, and right away he saw there were pool supplies scattered everywhere like they had fallen off the metal shelves they were kept on. And he saw a large blue tarp laying on the floor. And when Roger leaned down and lifted up the tarp to see what was underneath, his entire world shattered. His daughter, Allie, lay face down on the ground. Her t-shirt was tightly wrapped around her throat, and she was naked from the waist down. Her hands and arms were scratched and bloody, her face looked badly bruised and beaten, and her hair was matted with so much blood it stuck to the sides of her face. Roger grabbed his daughter and held her in his arms and told her to please stay with him. That evening, Sergeant Scott Hansen and Detective Joe Langer of the Leawood Police Department arrived at the neighborhood pool. They were still in shock from the call they'd gotten earlier from dispatch. A young woman had been brutally attacked at this pool, and she had been rushed to the hospital, but pronounced dead soon after. Violent crime in Leawood was rare, but a murder like this was just completely foreign to them. Hansen and Langer walked through the gate, and they quickly met a couple of uniformed police officers who led them around the pool to the crime scene. The door to the pump room was still open, and before they even walked in, the detectives saw pool supplies scattered everywhere, and a pool of blood on the floor near a blue tarp. The detectives put on their gloves and stepped into the room. Both men were known to be extremely calm and methodical, almost clinical when they conducted an investigation. But imagining what Allie must have gone through in this room made it impossible for them to hide their anger. They were part of this community, and they couldn't believe that something this horrific had happened to a young woman from their town. After the detectives had looked around the pump room for a few minutes on their own, several members of the county forensics team arrived and quickly began pulling blood samples from the floor. But as the group started investigating the pool supplies on the floor, one of the forensics officers told everyone to stop moving. He pointed to a small, white object on the ground, and he didn't want anyone to accidentally step on it or kick it. As the forensics officer inched across the ground towards this object, Langer and Hansen asked him, what was it? The forensics officer stared at it for a second, and then said it was a small cap to a bottle, and specifically, it had a brownish-red stain on it. The other officers continued to scan the floor. Partially hidden, amongst a bunch of pool supplies, one of them found a small tube of antibiotic ointment, and it had the same kind of stain on it as the cap. The forensics officers put the cap and the bottle side by side, and it was clear they went together. But both objects looked out of place among the other pool supplies on the floor. However, Detective Langer noticed an open first aid kit on a shelf, and he thought it might have come from there. But regardless, all the investigators felt sure that the brownish-red stains on the cap and on the tube were blood. So one of the forensics officers bagged the tube and the cap as evidence. While the forensics team continued their work in the pump room, the detectives walked back outside and made their way towards the pool. They immediately saw that the arrival of the police had already drawn a lot of attention. 2 uniformed officers were doing everything they could to keep a large and growing group of bystanders on the other side of the gate. The detectives headed over to the crowd, and with the help of the uniformed officer, they took down names and statements from everyone who was there who claimed to have been near the pool that day. One person in this group was the man who actually managed the pool, and he gave the detectives the name of employees and others who occasionally worked on site. Members of that landscaping crew were also in the group, and a couple of them said that the only strange thing they had noticed that afternoon was that somebody had been laying on their car horn in the parking lot, just honking over and over again. Also, one of the landscapers added that Allie did not appear to be the first pool employee to arrive that day. Before her, a young man had been there, and when he and Allie saw each other, they had kissed like they were girlfriend and boyfriend. Later that evening, Detectives Langer and Hansen sat together in a cramped interview room in the police station. They had met with Allie's father, Roger, and also the rest of her immediate family, and after seeing how absolutely devastated they were firsthand, it had really motivated both detectives to do everything they could to solve this case quickly and bring some peace back to this family. A little while later, the door to the interview room opened, and an officer led in Allie's boyfriend, Phil, who politely introduced himself to the detectives and then took a seat across from them. As the victim's boyfriend, Phil basically automatically had become the first suspect on the detectives' list, and the nature of this crime made it seem even more likely that an intimate partner could have committed it. The attacker had clearly been enraged, and there was potential sexual assault. But only minutes into their interview, and Phil had given the detectives his alibi. He had a job at another pool in the community, and he had gone there right after leaving the pool where he worked with Allie. The detectives reached out to his employer at the other pool, and they confirmed that Phil had arrived on time for his shift and had not left early or anything like that. And so Hansen and Langer asked Phil if he would still submit DNA samples, and he agreed to do it without any hesitation. And then after getting those samples, the detectives let him go. The detectives could not fully rule out Phil's involvement, but his alibi was very strong, so they had to admit to themselves that maybe this was not an open and shut case. Not long after the meeting with Phil, a young woman came into the police station requesting to speak to whoever was in charge of Allie's case. Hansen and Langer met this young woman, and she told them she was one of Allie's closest friends, and she had been at the pool that day, and she was sure she had seen Allie's killer. The detectives quickly led Allie's friend to an office and sat down with her. And Hansen said he was surprised to hear that she was at the pool, because everyone they'd spoken to so far had said nobody had been swimming that day. Allie's friend said she had not gone swimming either. She said she had pulled into the parking lot of the pool and begun honking her horn over and over again. She told them she was just doing it as a dumb joke, trying to annoy Allie while she worked alone at the pool. But after honking, she never saw Allie. Instead, she said she saw this guy walking out from somewhere on the far side of the pool. She thought it was Allie's boss, so she stopped honking the horn because she didn't want to get Allie in trouble. But this guy ended up walking to the parking lot and just driving off in an old pickup truck. Detectives Hansen and Langer couldn't believe this. Was there actually a chance this young woman just happened to be at the pool playing a joke on Allie at the exact time of the murder, and that she had also seen Allie's killer up close? It seemed too good to be true. Hansen asked her if she knew who the man was, but she said she didn't. However, she said the guy had kind of creeped her out, because before he got into his pickup and drove off, he had looked right at her with a strange look on his face and smiled at her. As midnight approached on June 18, 2002, about 6 hours after Allie's body had been discovered, her dad Roger walked into the University of Kansas City Medical Center and approached the morgue. He knew this was where his daughter's body had been taken for an autopsy the next day. Roger found an employee and told her he'd be staying there that night. The employee was confused and said they weren't really set up for visitors. Roger said he understood, but he couldn't bear the idea that his daughter was all alone. The employee nodded and said he could stay if he wanted to. Roger thanked her, took a seat on a bench, and began his overnight vigil. In the days following the murder, detectives Hansen and Langer learned from the autopsy report that while Allie did have bruises that seemed to indicate an attempted sexual assault, no sexual assault had actually taken place. They also learned that she had put up a major fight, and so the medical examiner and the forensics team hoped they would find samples of the killer's DNA under her fingernails. And so while Hansen and Langer waited for these test results, they met with Allie's friends and family to try to get a clearer picture of her life. And they quickly realized Allie was not a young woman who lived dangerously at all. Allie was a standout student, she did volunteer work, she had a job at school and also over the summer, and she didn't seem to do drugs or drink alcohol. For the most part, her close friends and her boyfriend Phil led similar lives. So the detectives did not think Allie was mixed up in anything or with anyone that would have made her a target for a violent crime. And when they got the result of Phil's DNA test, there was no match to the crime scene. In fact, none of the DNA samples collected so far matched anyone in the FBI's national database. And so now, Hansen and Langer had to face the fact that they might be dealing with one of the hardest types of homicide cases to solve: a murder committed by an unidentified stranger. These types of cases can be so difficult that police often use the old cliché about trying to find a needle in a haystack when talking about them, because the suspect pool is basically infinite. At this point, Langer and Hansen's strongest lead was the man that Allie's friend had seen leaving the pool and getting into his pickup truck on the afternoon Allie was killed. But the detectives had no idea who this guy was. So they had Allie's friend sit down with a police sketch artist to describe the man as best as she could, and the police started distributing copies of the artist's drawing all over town. At first, this seemed like the right strategy to tackle a possible murder by a stranger because people started contacting the Leawood Police Department with tips almost right away. But this quickly proved to be overwhelming because the man in the drawing kind of looked like a lot of people. He was white, in his late 20s or early 30s, a little overweight, and starting to lose his hair. And so detectives Hansen and Langer soon found themselves fielding calls from all over the county. But most of these leads fizzled out almost immediately. At one point, weeks after the murder, the tips got so out of control in Leawood that people were approaching Hansen, Langer, and other members of the police force out in public just to claim that they were sure their brother-in-law or their cousin or some guy they saw was the person from the drawing. The investigative team got help from the county sheriff's department and other law enforcement agencies to try to pursue any viable lead, but none of these tips really seemed to go anywhere. And all of a sudden, months had gone by, and Langer and Hansen felt like despite chasing countless leads, they had basically made no headway in the case. And when 2002 came to an end, 6 months after Allie's murder, the detectives worried that the case was going cold and that they would soon be pulled off of it. On a morning in early February of 2003, so 8 months after Allie's murder, detectives Langer and Hansen were working together in Hansen's office when they got a message that Roger Kemp, Allie's father, was there to see them. Langer and Hansen had made a point to meet with Roger throughout the investigation, but they knew he had grown frustrated that no new evidence seemed to be coming in. Hansen went out to meet Roger, handed him a cup of coffee, and then led him back to the office. The detectives began by apologizing to Roger that they didn't have anything new to tell him, but Roger said he knew they were both doing everything they could. Still, though, he refused to just sit around and do nothing, and he understood as well as the detectives that if things didn't change soon, Allie's murder investigation would become a cold case. And so Roger said he had an idea that he wanted to run by the detectives, something he thought would help get the public thinking about Allie's case again. He wanted to put the sketch of the man Allie's friend had seen on some huge billboards in town and maybe out on the highway. He said he also wanted to offer a $50,000 reward for anyone who provided a tip that led police to Allie's killer. Roger said he would pay half, and he believed he could get the city to provide the other half. Hansen and Langer discussed it for a second, At the time, using billboards in a murder investigation was a radical idea. Police generally used billboards to help in missing person cases, but Langer and Hansen had never heard of using billboards to showcase a potential murder suspect. Still, they knew they did need to jumpstart the investigation, and this would definitely get people thinking about Allie again. And really, they were not about to tell Roger he couldn't do something that might help bring him and his family some kind of closure. A few days after this meeting, the first billboard featuring the drawing of the potential suspect went up in Leawood, and it would soon be followed by 3 more billboards. And almost right away, tips started coming into the police station again. And just like the last time this happened, it got overwhelming. But Langer and Hansen felt energized that the investigation had sort of gotten back on its feet. And so the detectives and their team methodically followed up on any leads that came in. Then, on June 18th, 2003, which happened to be the 1-year anniversary of Allie's death, they got a tip that felt huge. Someone who had seen one of the billboards called the tip line to say the guy in the drawing looked exactly like someone he knew, a man named Ted Hoover. And when Langer and Hansen heard this name, it immediately rang a bell. And so they dug through Allie's case file, and they came back to the notes they had taken from the very first day of the murder investigation. And that's when they saw Ted's name. He was the owner of a local pool maintenance company. Detectives Langer and Hansen didn't waste any time. They got Ted's address, headed out to their car, and drove across town. And when they arrived at Ted's house, they saw an old pickup truck parked in the driveway. It didn't exactly fit Allie's friend's description of the truck she had seen in the pool parking lot, but the detectives knew witnesses didn't always get all the details right, especially if they were uncomfortable or creeped out like Allie's friend had said she'd been. Langer and Hansen felt like, for the first time in this investigation, they might finally have the killer in their sights. Both men stayed completely calm as they approached the front door. They needed Ted to talk, so they didn't want to frighten him in any way. Hansen knocked on the door, and a few seconds later, a man answered. And this man looked remarkably similar to the sketch the detectives have been staring at every day for the past year. But the detectives didn't give off any signal that they thought that. Instead, they introduced themselves and asked the man if his name was Ted Hoover. He said it was, and so the detectives asked him if they could come inside and ask him a few questions about the young woman who had been killed at the public pool a year earlier. Ted, who seemed as calm as the detectives, said sure, and he led them inside. The 3 men sat down in the front room of the house, and Detective Langer started things off by telling Ted that somebody had called the tip line and pointed to him. And so Langer wanted to know if Ted had been anywhere near the pool where Allie worked on the day that she was killed. Ted remained totally calm. He said he was not surprised he'd come up on the tip line. He'd seen the billboards, and he knew he kind of looked like the man in the drawing. He also said he had not done any work on the pool where Allie worked, but he did have a lot of clients around the area, so there was a chance he could have been maybe nearby that day, but he wasn't sure, and he wasn't great about keeping records of exactly what he did every single day. The detectives looked at each other. This all seemed way too convenient. So Langer asked if Ted had ever met Allie Kemp, either at the pool where she worked or somewhere else in town. And Ted shook his head. He said he didn't know her, and he definitely did not have anything to do with her death. The detective spoke to Ted for a bit longer, and he was very cooperative throughout the entire interview. However, he couldn't provide them with any kind of solid alibi. And so at some point, Langer asked Ted if he would submit a DNA sample, just so they could cross him off the list. And at that point, the calm look on Ted's face completely disappeared, and he started acting very nervous. Ted must have noticed right away the vibe he was giving off, because he quickly told the detectives that his nervousness had nothing to do with the case. He just didn't like the idea of his DNA being part of some kind of national database. That just didn't sit right with him. The detectives tried to assure Ted that his sample would only be used to help with this particular case, but Ted said he didn't want anything to do with it, and he would need to speak with a lawyer. By the time Langer and Hansen left Ted's house, they were confident they had just found Allie's killer. His appearance alone had already been pretty solid evidence. I mean, he looked exactly like the sketch. But also, the detectives just didn't buy his paranoia around the national database thing. They figured the real reason he was afraid to give a DNA sample was because he knew the results would incriminate him. Since Ted did not voluntarily give up a DNA sample, the detectives would have to find enough evidence pointing to him that would enable them to secure a warrant so they could demand Ted to provide a DNA sample. And they knew if Ted really was lawyering up, their case would need to be airtight just to get that warrant. So, over the next several weeks, the detectives tried to find any proof they could that Ted had been at the pool on the day Allie got murdered. They got back in touch with the landscaping crew, Allie's boyfriend, and anyone else they thought might have seen him, but they didn't have any luck. Langer and Hansen refused to give up on this lead, though. It was the first time in over a year that they believed they were close to solving the case. So they dug deeper into Ted Hoover's background, hoping to find anything that might give them a clue. And they ended up finding something that completely blew their minds. Because according to multiple government documents, Ted Hoover had been dead for over a decade. With this bizarre new discovery, Langer and Hansen went to meet with Ted again. But this time, his house was empty, and none of his neighbors or clients had seen or heard from him. It was like he had vanished without the police even noticing. Hansen and Langer set out to find anyone who might know where Ted was, but nobody knew where he was, and nobody seemed to have spoken to him since he left. And the detectives knew that trying to locate a man who'd supposedly been dead for years and had seemingly just disappeared into thin air seemed like an impossible task. But the detectives caught a huge break when a couple of people who knew Ted said that before he disappeared, he had been dating a woman named Lara Barr. So Hansen and Langer shifted their focus to her, but tracking Lara down proved to be as difficult as tracking down Ted. She was nowhere to be found in Leawood, or anywhere in Kansas for that matter. Weeks, months, and then an entire year went by, and the detectives were still trying to find this woman who could maybe lead them to the man they were actually looking for. And in the meantime, they had to tell Allie's dad, Roger, that even though they believed they knew who had killed his daughter, they couldn't track him down. Finally, in the fall of 2004, which was almost 2.5 years after Allie's murder, Detective Langer got a hit on Lara Barr. He learned that Ted's one-time girlfriend, Lara, was now living in Connecticut with a man named Benjamin Appleby, an ex-convict who had been busted for armed robbery and indecent exposure. And when the detectives began digging into Benjamin Appleby's background as just part of their general investigation into Lara Barr, they realized Benjamin Appleby had a clear connection to Leawood, Kansas, and to Allie's murder case. In November of 2004, about 2 weeks after Langer and Hansen first located Lara, the detectives sat inside of an interview room with local detectives at a small police station in Connecticut. An officer led Lara in, and Langer asked her about her relationship with their suspect, Ted Hoover, and any connection Ted might have to Allie. Lara appeared to be as helpful as she possibly could be, but it became pretty clear within a few minutes of talking to her that she didn't seem to have any helpful information or really any connection to the murder. However, when her new partner, Benjamin Appleby, stepped into the interview room later that day, everything changed. Just looking at Benjamin made the hair on the back of Langer's neck stand up. And as the detectives spoke to Benjamin, slowly but surely, they realized he must know more about what happened to Allie than he was letting on. And so the detectives went on the attack, asking blunt and aggressive questions. And this tactic paid off, because the more they pushed, the more Benjamin began to crack. And soon, Benjamin broke down crying and said he knew who killed Allie. Based on Benjamin's interview, DNA testing, and evidence collected over the course of the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Allie Kemp on the afternoon of June 18, 2002. The killer walked through the gate and began to scan the area. They saw the pool was completely empty, and that the landscaping crew that had been working nearby had moved far enough away that the killer could remain out of their sight. The killer walked around the pool towards the pump room and then said out loud, "Is anybody here?" Even though the killer had clearly watched Allie from the parking lot and seen her walk that way, so they knew she was over here. And a moment later, Allie called out from the pump room that she'd be out in a second, and when the killer heard that, they felt a rush. and before Allie could even step out of the pump room, the killer stood in front of the door and blocked it, and then made a lewd remark about Allie's appearance and also made a clear sexual advance towards her. But Allie brushed the killer off and told them to get out of the way and tried to walk past them. The killer grabbed Allie and touched her breast, at which point Allie threw a punch. The killer blocked Allie's fist and immediately lost it and flew into a rage. They grabbed Allie by the shoulders and shoved her further back into the pump room, but Allie fought back, swinging her fists and scratching at the killer's hands and face. But the killer slammed her into the metal shelves and pool equipment fell onto the floor. Allie kept fighting, but the killer punched her in the head and face several times, stunning her and causing her to begin bleeding badly. The killer threw Allie to the floor and tore off her shorts and underwear, but Allie kept fighting back, so the killer punched her again and again until Allie finally stopped moving. At this point, the killer got up, opened a first aid kit that was on one of the shelves, grabbed a bottle of antibiotic ointment to use as a lubricant, and got back on the floor. Allie was still breathing, but she could no longer fight back. The killer began to undress themselves. Then they took off the cap of the bottle and climbed back on top of Allie. And just then, the sound of a car horn began to blare over and over again from the parking lot, and the killer panicked. By this point, they had already decided they were going to rape and then kill Allie, but now they were worried they were running out of time. Somebody was here. They were going to get caught. So the killer reached for the bottom of Allie's t-shirt, and at that point, Allie began moving again, and she tried to fight off the killer one more time. But the killer turned Allie over, pulled her t-shirt up to her neck, and wrapped it around her throat, and strangled her to death. Afterwards, the killer stood up and stared down at Allie's body. They looked around the room and saw a large blue tarp tucked in a corner. The killer grabbed the tarp, covered Allie's body with it, tried to pull themselves together as much as possible, and then walked out. The killer then made their way to their pickup truck in the pool parking lot, and before they got in, they made eye contact and smiled at a young woman who was sitting in her car. They didn't realize she was Allie's friend and was the one who had honked the horn. The killer then drove home, convinced they had not been seen by anyone who could pin Allie's murder on them. And for almost 3 years, the killer would believe they had been right. Until one day, a couple of detectives from Kansas came to Connecticut to question them. It would turn out Benjamin Appleby, the man who was Laura's new partner living in Connecticut with her, murdered Allie. However, that was not remotely the whole story, because it turned out Benjamin Appleby was also Ted Hoover, the pool maintenance worker and the investigator's prime suspect. Benjamin had done prison time for multiple charges in Missouri where he was from, so he decided to leave his name and his past behind. He moved around to a few different places, and eventually he assumed the identity of a boyhood friend of his who had died at the age of 13, Ted Hoover. And with this dead person's name, he moved to Leawood, Kansas, and started his pool maintenance business. That's how he had first seen Allie and decided that he wanted her. But when Allie rejected his blatantly sexual advance one afternoon at the pool, he decided to rape and kill her. But Allie's friend honking her car horn in the parking lot altered those plans and made him go right to the murder. After Benjamin killed Allie, he went about his life like nothing had happened. And even when Allie's dad got the billboards put up with Benjamin's image clearly on them, he didn't panic. But when detectives Langer and Hansen showed up at his house asking for DNA samples, he realized they were closing in on him. So he decided to flee to Connecticut with his girlfriend Laura and start using his birth name again. But eventually, when the detectives tracked Laura down and learned she was living with this ex-con, a guy named Benjamin Appleby, well, they decided to look into Benjamin Appleby, and sure enough, it turned out he was Ted Hoover. When they finally interviewed Ben Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, in Connecticut, it seemed to the detectives almost like he was an entirely different person. The relatively calm, cooperative man they had spoken to in Kansas had transformed into someone who seemed completely devoid of feeling or empathy, someone they believed was evil from the second he walked in the door. In that interview, Benjamin ultimately confessed to everything. However, the detectives didn't want to leave any room for a court case to fall apart, so they finally got a DNA sample. And when the test results came back, Benjamin's DNA matched the sample they had taken from the blood on the bottle and bottle cap at the crime scene. Benjamin Appleby, aka Ted Hoover, was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole in 50 years. Roger Kemp's idea for running billboards with the potential murderer's sketch on them was a first-of-its-kind strategy in law enforcement. But now, as a result of its effectiveness in Allie's case, this strategy has been adopted by police departments all across the United States. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On April 26, 2002, a man was walking towards his apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina, when he noticed something moving around in the bushes. The man stopped and looked closer, and to his horror, he saw a peeping Tom. A person was literally standing there in the bushes with their face up against the glass, looking in the window of this young girl's bedroom. And so the man who saw this immediately yelled aggressively at the peeping Tom, which sent the peeping Tom running for their life. When word spread about this incident, residents of the complex were hopeful that the peeping Tom was so scared from getting caught that they would never do it again. But unfortunately, they would be wrong, because that peeping Tom was not just being creepy. They were also planning something evil. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please gift the Amazon Music follow button and above ground pool, but don't tell them you've secretly poked hundreds of holes in the bottom liner. Okay, let's get into today's story. On April 26, 2002, 23-year-old Stephanie Bennett parked her car outside of her apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina. Stephanie was worn out from a long week at work, and so she was looking forward to relaxing and spending time with her friends over this weekend. She grabbed her purse off the passenger seat, got out of her car, and began walking towards her apartment. Stephanie was dressed in business casual work clothes. She had shoulder-length brown hair, brown eyes, and a huge smile. Stephanie's friends said she looked like she could play the perfect girl next door on a TV show. It was a beautiful spring evening in Raleigh, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and Stephanie saw a bunch of people out by the lake that was only about 100 yards from her apartment building. Stephanie just continued walking towards the lake, and as she did, she saw all these people out having fun and walking around and jogging with their dogs. Most of the people were Stephanie's neighbors, or they lived in the apartments just on the other side of the woods that were next to her apartment complex. And while Stephanie loved seeing all the familiar faces out there by the lake, who she really liked seeing were all the dogs. And that evening, Stephanie saw a dog she thought looked particularly happy. A big black and brown Rottweiler trotting in front of its owner with its tongue hanging out of its mouth. Stephanie smiled wide and walked over to the owner and the dog, and she leaned down and said hello to the dog. Then after that, she said hello to a couple of her neighbors who were nearby, and then finally she just turned and headed towards her first floor apartment. Stephanie stepped inside and found her two roommates waiting for her on the couch. The three women had been friends for years, and they still spent as much time together as they could, even though their lives had gotten really busy with work and with boyfriends. Stephanie told her roommates she'd be back in a couple of minutes, and then she went to her bedroom. There, she changed out of her work clothes and put on a t-shirt and jeans. It was Friday, but she and her roommates did not have any big plans. They were just going to hang out at home together. After getting changed, Stephanie grabbed the cordless phone off her bedside table and she called her boyfriend, Walter Robinson. Walter and Stephanie had been together for 4 years, and they were planning on getting married someday. Walter had even bought Stephanie a promise ring, which is a piece of jewelry that typically precedes an engagement ring. Walter picked up the phone on the other end, and he and Stephanie talked about how their days had gone. Stephanie's face lit up whenever she talked to Walter, and she was always happiest when she was with him. But at the time, they couldn't really be together nearly as much as they wanted to because Walter had moved to South Carolina for grad school. They were only about a 4-hour drive from each other, and they would go back and forth to see each other all the time. But that wasn't enough for Stephanie. She wanted to live with Walter and be with him all the time. So recently, she had made the decision to move to South Carolina as well. And she and Walter had already begun looking for an apartment they could share. On the phone, Stephanie told Walter how much she missed him, and he reminded her that she would be in South Carolina before she knew it and everything would be perfect. Stephanie told Walter that she loved him and then hung up the phone. She was a bit sad when she had to say goodbye, but her roommates were waiting for her in the living room and they could always cheer her up. That night, Stephanie and her roommates ate dinner, they watched TV, and basically just made each other laugh for hours. Stephanie knew her friends were going to miss her when she moved to South Carolina, but they were also really excited that she was about to take this next big step in her life. A few hours later, Stephanie and her roommates were still sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. They weren't expecting anyone, but they lived in the type of apartment complex where neighbors would sometimes drop by to borrow things like sugar or laundry detergent. So Stephanie got off the couch and walked over to the door and opened it up. And standing on the other side was one of her neighbors, a middle-aged guy she knew pretty well, and he looked very shaken. Stephanie's roommates joined Stephanie at the door to see what was going on. Stephanie asked the neighbor if everything was okay, and the man just shook his head and said no. He said he had been walking by outside when he saw something moving in their bushes. It was dark out, and the lights at the apartment were not very bright, so at first he thought it might just be an animal. But as he got closer, he said he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt, and that the man's face was pressed up against Stephanie's bedroom window. When the neighbor had called out to him, this peeping Tom had run off, so the neighbor didn't get a good look at him. When Stephanie heard this, she felt a chill run down her spine. Earlier that night, she'd been in her room taking off her work clothes, and she pictured this guy in this hooded sweatshirt just standing there watching her. The neighbor told them he had reported the incident to the apartment manager, but he said Stephanie and her roommates really needed to be extra careful to always lock their doors and keep their blinds closed. They thanked the neighbor for letting them know, and then as soon as he left, Stephanie shut and locked the door. Then the three roommates just stood there in the living room, kind of stunned by what they had just learned. They knew their apartments were not the nicest place to live or anything, but they'd always felt safe here. Now they had to worry about some pervert peeking into their windows and trying to watch them undress. A few minutes later, Stephanie went back into her bedroom. Immediately, she adjusted the blinds on the window so nobody would be able to look in from the outside. Then she thought about maybe telling her boyfriend, Walter, or her dad about what had just happened. She knew they both prided themselves on being strong Southern gentlemen who protected women, but in this case, Stephanie felt like there really wasn't anything either of them could do. The incident had already been reported, and knowing about it would just make her father and Walter angry and upset. And so Stephanie told herself everything would be fine, and in just a couple of months, she'd be long gone to South Carolina, far away from this apartment and the creep who tried to spy on her. On May 20th, 2002, so almost a month after the Peeping Tom incident, Stephanie was getting back home from work again. She got out of her car and she saw people walking around the lake like usual, but this night she didn't stop to talk to any dogs or any of her neighbors. Instead, she went straight to her apartment. The truth was, Stephanie had been feeling anxious and upset all day. The weekend before, she had gone to South Carolina to see her boyfriend, Walter, and it was the happiest she had been in weeks because they had found the perfect apartment. But when it was time for her to drive back home, Stephanie had broken down in tears and told Walter that she just wanted to stay with him. She didn't want to leave. He said he felt the same way, but he reminded her that she'd be back here for good in only a month, and that the time between now and then would fly by. Stephanie knew he was right, but she still felt like every day she spent in Raleigh was a day she wasn't as happy as she could be. And so Stephanie walked into her apartment and quickly closed and locked the door behind her, and right away she had to admit to herself that there was actually another reason she was feeling so anxious. Both of her roommates were out of town, and since she'd learned about the peeping Tom a month earlier, she had hated being alone in this apartment. Without her roommates there, the place just felt empty. It felt too quiet. So Stephanie turned on the TV just for some background noise. Then she made herself dinner, sat down on the couch, and watched TV while she ate. At about 8 p.m., so a couple of hours after she'd gotten home, Stephanie called Walter from the living room, and they talked about all the things they were going to put in their new apartment to make it really feel like home. Talking to Walter definitely cheered Stephanie up, but she was still dreading sleeping in her apartment by herself. So after she hung up with her boyfriend, Stephanie made herself a cup of tea, which she'd always been told was good to calm the nerves. She took her tea into the bedroom, but left her bedroom door open a crack. She just wanted to make sure she could hear any noises coming from other parts of her apartment. Stephanie then put her cup of tea down on the bedside table and then glanced over at the window to make sure the blinds were still closed. When she saw they were, she felt comfortable, so she got undressed, put on a nightgown, and climbed into bed. Then she reached over and took a sip of her tea, and then picked up a book and read for a bit. After finally feeling relaxed, Stephanie put the book down, flipped off the light, and began to fall asleep. The following afternoon, Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, came out of one of his grad school classes and immediately began scrolling through his contact list on his phone. Walter and Stephanie talked almost every morning before she went to work and he went to class. But that morning, Stephanie had not answered her phone when he called. Walter hadn't thought much about it. There was a chance that maybe Stephanie had been getting ready for work or that she'd gone in early. But Walter had tried calling a few more times since then, and he had sent Stephanie a couple of emails, but he still hadn't heard back. Walter was getting worried. It was just weird for Stephanie not to respond to him at all. After scrolling for a minute, Walter finally found the number for one of Stephanie's roommates on his phone. Then he walked out of the building and called the friend while he headed to his car. Walter told the roommate what was going on, and the roommate said that Stephanie hadn't answered her phone when she called either, and so the roommate said that she was worried too. She told Walter she was out of town right now, but she'd called their apartment manager, and the manager could at least go by their place to just see if Stephanie was at home. Walter thanked the roommate and then tried to convince himself that everything was going to be okay. At 3:30 p.m., the apartment manager approached Stephanie's door. Stephanie's roommate had given the apartment manager permission to unlock the apartment and go inside. And so, after knocking and not getting an answer, the apartment manager pulled out a key and opened up the door and walked into the living room. And right away, nothing looked out of the ordinary. So she called out to see if anybody was home, but the place was silent. So the manager walked into the hallway that led to each of the 3 bedrooms. Stephanie's bedroom door was closed, but the door across the hall was open just a crack. So the manager walked down the hallway and looked through that crack into that room, and what she saw caused her to turn and run down the hall screaming. And then once she got outside, she frantically pulled out her phone and called 911. About 10 minutes after that 911 call, Lieutenant Chris Morgan, head of the Violent Crimes Task Force in Raleigh, put on his white fedora hat and walked out of his office. Lieutenant Morgan was a big guy, and he seemed even bigger when he spoke in his booming southern drawl. But it was really that white fedora, with its soft brim and indented crown, that made people always notice him wherever he went. In truth, Morgan had begun wearing the hat when he was a young investigator because he liked how it looked. It was a throwback to lawmen from an earlier time. But Morgan had proven to be a highly skilled detective, and the more crimes he solved, the more attached he became to this white hat. Over time, Morgan had started to see the hat as some kind of a magical charm that helped him close case after case. A little before 4 p.m., Morgan arrived at Stephanie's apartment. Other officers and crime scene analysts were already hard at work. One of the officers greeted the lieutenant and then quickly ushered him down the hallway to one of the bedrooms. Morgan stepped inside the bedroom and looked down at the floor. Right away, he took up his fedora and stood there respectfully for a full minute, not moving or talking. Everyone who worked with Morgan knew that his big outward persona was actually just a small part of who he was. Inside, Morgan was a highly empathetic person, and it was his empathy that really made him such a great cop. He had worked violent crimes for years, but he still felt heartbroken every time he saw a victim. Violent crimes were an attack on his community and a robbery of everything the victim would have experienced in their life. After his moment of silence was over, Morgan put his hat back on and crouched down to the floor. He was looking at one of the most gruesome crime scenes he'd ever witnessed. The young woman lying there had already been identified as Stephanie Bennett, and Stephanie was lying on her back, naked, with her arms and legs stretched out to the sides. There were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles from where she had clearly been tied up. There was a dark purple mark around her neck, and there was a pair of blue women's underwear stuffed inside of her mouth. Lieutenant Morgan was sure the mark on Stephanie's neck meant she had been strangled to death, but Morgan just couldn't get over how pronounced that mark on her neck was. Whoever had done this to Stephanie had inflicted as much pain on her as they possibly could. Then Lieutenant Morgan called over one of the crime scene analysts. He wanted confirmation of something he already knew to be true. He told the analyst he believed there were clear signs of sexual assault, and the analyst agreed. Morgan stood up. He felt angry and sick, but he knew that in the case of sexual assault, there would be DNA samples from the attacker on the victim's body, and that was evidence Morgan could use to catch the person who did this. Looking around the room, Morgan saw that the window was closed, but the window screen had been removed. He thought there was a chance that that window was how the killer had entered the apartment. But Morgan also noticed several photos on the wall in this room that were of a young woman who was not Stephanie, so he assumed that this was actually not Stephanie's bedroom. So Lieutenant Morgan walked to the bedroom across the hall, and right away he saw pictures of Stephanie and her friends and family in there, so he knew this was her room. And so for some reason, the killer had carried out their attack on Stephanie in her roommate's bedroom. Morgan thought, perhaps the killer just wanted to stay close to their exit route, which would be through the roommate's window. Morgan walked around Stephanie's bedroom, and the way it was decorated really hit him hard. There were stuffed animals on the bed and Harry Potter books on the shelves. All he could think was that Stephanie was barely older than a kid, and some horrible person had crept in here and taken everything from her. Morgan also started thinking about all the apartment complexes near the lake. They were home to a lot of other young women like Stephanie, so Morgan really had to act fast to make sure this did not happen to anyone else. At 9 a.m. the following morning, Lieutenant Morgan and his investigative team were back at Stephanie's apartment complex. They had only wrapped up their initial search a few hours earlier, so most of them had barely slept. But nobody would know that from looking at Morgan. He was full of energy when he walked around the complex to meet up with Stephanie's neighbors. He wanted to know if anybody had seen or heard something on the night of the murder. But nobody had noticed anything strange. In fact, it had been so quiet that the neighbors who shared a wall with Stephanie's bedroom said they hadn't heard any noise at all. Morgan had his team collect information on everybody they could find at the apartment complex. But because of the nature of the crime, the sexual assault and very violent murder, he figured they were looking for a man. Normally, Morgan's first suspect would have been Stephanie's boyfriend, Walter, because in the United States, almost 35% of female murder victims are killed by an intimate partner. But the night before, Morgan had contacted Walter in South Carolina, and the young man had completely broken down on the phone when he heard about what happened to his girlfriend. And Morgan's team was quickly able to locate multiple witnesses who had been with Walter at the time of the murder. So Morgan turned his attention to the men in Stephanie's apartment complex, and he found that almost every man his team spoke to was willing to provide DNA samples. In fact, just about everybody who had known Stephanie, even if they had barely known her, told police they would do whatever it took to help police find her killer. They just kept saying how kind Stephanie had been to everyone, that this just didn't make any sense. While members of Morgan's team collected DNA samples from Stephanie's male neighbors, Morgan met with residents who had not been home when police first arrived. And Morgan pretty quickly found someone who had information that could help. It was the neighbor who had warned Stephanie and her roommates about the peeping Tom a month earlier. The neighbor recounted his story about seeing the peeping Tom, but as hard as he tried, he really could not give Morgan much of a description. Then, Morgan spoke to another resident, a man with a very heavy Czech accent, who claimed to have also seen the peeping Tom. But, just like Stephanie's neighbor, the guy with the heavy Czech accent really did not get a good look at him. He just said the guy at Stephanie's window appeared to be white, so Caucasian, he was pretty big, and he appeared to have short hair. Morgan thanked both of the men for their help, because even without a detailed description from either one of them, they had actually given investigators a major lead here. And Morgan thought the killer could have been spying on Stephanie through her window for weeks or months, picturing her as their victim and devising their plan. So Morgan rounded up his team and told them to start looking for anyone who might fit the limited description they had of this peeping Tom. Then, Morgan returned to Stephanie's apartment to see if maybe there was anything he might have missed. But what Morgan didn't know was someone was watching him while he was doing this. They were hidden in the shadows of the parking lot, and they could see everything that was going on. After speaking to Stephanie's neighbors, Lieutenant Morgan had focused his investigation on finding this peeping Tom. But so far, police had come up empty in their search. Lieutenant Morgan encouraged his team to please remain patient because he believed the peeping Tom would slip up and they would eventually get him. Because Morgan was convinced this peeping Tom would not just stop with Stephanie, they would start looking for another victim. So Morgan had made sure to have officers on site at Stephanie's apartment complex and the other complexes nearby in case this peeping Tom started looking in other windows. On the night of June 3rd, so roughly 2 weeks after Stephanie was murdered, a young police officer was walking the grounds of one of the apartment complexes near Stephanie's. And suddenly, this officer heard something coming from the bushes a few yards away. The officer quickly crouched down behind a nearby wall so he'd be out of sight. And then the officer craned his neck around that wall, and he focused on the bushes, and there he saw a man standing in them looking through an apartment window. The young officer saw this man, this peeping Tom, lean his face right up against the glass, and then he also saw this peeping Tom undo his belt and then reach into his pants. The moment this happened, the young officer radioed for help and then got out from behind that wall and began sprinting towards this guy in the bushes. The peeping Tom heard the officer, turned, and started to run. The young officer sprinted after him, but the peeping Tom was fast. However, just then, 2 more officers came running out of the darkness from the other direction, and they leapt at this man and tackled him to the ground. The peeping Tom tried to break free, but the officers kept him pinned down and got him handcuffed. The young officer who originally spotted the peeping Tom eventually joined the other 2 officers totally out of breath, and then he called into the station and told Lieutenant Morgan they had finally caught the peeping Tom. And as the officers led the peeping Tom to a police cruiser, they had no idea there was somebody else nearby watching their every move. Later that night, the peeping Tom sat in an interrogation room at the police station. In the hours following his arrest, police had been able to identify him as Christopher Campen. He was 34 years old, he had short hair that matched the description police had gotten, and he had an extensive criminal record. Christopher had been arrested multiple times on misdemeanor charges for, quote, secret peeping, end quote, also stalking, and also exposing himself. And those were all acts that police considered potential gateway crimes that could eventually lead someone to commit full-blown sexual assault or even murder. So, for the first time since Stephanie had been murdered, Lieutenant Morgan thought he had a real potential suspect here. Morgan stepped into the interrogation room and sat across from Christopher. Morgan took off his white fedora hat and put it down on the table, and then greeted Christopher in his booming voice. And that voice, and Morgan's sheer size, made Christopher immediately shift in his chair uncomfortably and look down at the floor. Morgan told Christopher that police knew all about his criminal history, and they knew that earlier that night he'd been spying on a young woman while she got into the shower. Then Morgan just sat back and stared at Christopher. And as he did, Christopher remained silent and just kept shifting around in his seat. Finally, Morgan just asked him if he knew Stephanie Bennett. Christopher immediately sat up straight in his chair, and a look of fear came across his face. He told Morgan he knew who Stephanie was. Basically everybody in Raleigh did, because the case was all over the news. But he said he actually didn't know her, and he didn't have anything to do with what had happened to her. Now, there was no denying what police had caught him doing that night, looking in the woman's window, but he said that did not mean he was also a murderer. Morgan nodded, and then asked Christopher some questions about his criminal history. But the more Christopher spoke, the more Lieutenant Morgan felt like something was off here. There was no question that everybody in the police department, including Morgan, hoped they had found Stephanie's killer when they brought Christopher in. After all, he was caught red-handed being a peeping Tom. He also roughly fit the description of the man who had been seen watching Stephanie through her window, but Morgan had made a long, successful career out of reading people, and he was right way more often than he was wrong. And listening to Christopher, he just did not think this guy could be behind the absolutely horrific crime scene he saw in Stephanie's apartment. A lot of organization and planning had gone into Stephanie's murder. Her killer had clearly been calculated and patient, and they had not left any discernible fingerprints anywhere. But the way Christopher spoke seemed completely scattered, not calm or organized at all. Morgan knew others in the investigation would not want to hear the theory that had just crossed Morgan's mind, that there might be two different peeping Toms in the apartment complexes near the lake, and that this one they had arrested was not the right one. It was not the murdering peeping Tom. Still, Lieutenant Morgan was a strong believer in science, so that night, police still charged Christopher with secret peeping and resisting arrest, and officers swabbed his cheeks to obtain DNA samples. Now they would have to wait to see if Christopher's DNA matched the DNA found on Stephanie's body. It only took a few days for Lieutenant Morgan to be proven right about Christopher. The DNA samples did not match those found at the crime scene. Christopher was indeed a peeping Tom, but he was not Stephanie's killer. Morgan, by this point, had been pretty sure that this would be the outcome, but he was still disappointed. He had stayed in close contact with Stephanie's family, and he had promised them that Stephanie's killer would be found. But now he was getting concerned, because they were weeks into this investigation, and he no longer had any legitimate leads. And not long after Christopher's DNA test results came in, Morgan got more bad news from the crime lab. The DNA samples found on Stephanie's body did not match any samples in the state or national DNA databases. In short, that meant that the one major piece of evidence investigators had found had not given them any idea who killed Stephanie. So Morgan went back to square one and just started re-interviewing residents at Stephanie's apartment complex. But he didn't discover anything that gave him the break in the case they desperately needed. On top of that, there was something else that kept gnawing at Morgan. Almost every man who lived in the apartments had voluntarily provided DNA samples, but there were a few men who had refused. However, without just cause, Morgan couldn't force them to submit DNA samples. So he believed there was still a chance that someone who lived close to Stephanie was her killer. Police just needed something to point them in the right direction. They at least needed enough evidence to get a warrant to obtain the DNA samples they were missing. But after months of interviewing residents and monitoring the grounds, investigators still did not have anything to go on. And by the fall of 2002, Morgan knew the case was going cold. And as more time passed, he felt like he was failing Stephanie's family. Then 2002 came to an end, and then all of 2003 passed with no real progress on the case. Stephanie's story slowly disappeared from the media, and it almost seemed like the community had moved on. But Morgan was determined to keep the promise he'd made to Stephanie's family, even if he was not the one to solve Stephanie's murder. In April of 2004, almost 2 years after Stephanie's murder, Lieutenant Morgan called on Detective Ken Copeland to take over Stephanie's case. Copeland was a member of the Ha-Awa-Saponi Indian tribe, and he'd grown up in a rural area not far from Raleigh. He also was a former United States Marine who looked like he could punch a hole through a brick wall. But most importantly to Morgan, Detective Copeland was known around the department as the, quote, garbage man. Copeland was so detail-oriented that he would often find small pieces of evidence that other cops had just assumed were garbage. So Morgan knew that if anyone could discover something that he had missed, it would be Detective Copeland. After getting the assignment, Copeland immediately laid out a plan to re-interview as many people as he could at Stephanie's apartment complex who had been a part of the initial investigation. He hoped that somebody would have new information for him. The process was slow going, and getting people to help police again, years after the murder, was not always easy. But several residents did tell Copeland something that had not come up before. They said they remembered seeing someone that they didn't know who seemed to spend day after day after day just watching the police conduct their investigation during that initial investigation period. But nobody could give Copeland a decent description of this person because this person always seemed to be just out of sight or blending in with a crowd. Nothing Copeland heard was enough to give him a solid lead, but he was sure this was significant, and he wondered if maybe the killer had come back to the scene of the crime just to relish in what they had done. But even with this new information, Copeland did not rush to any conclusions. He was trying to rebuild this case from the ground up, and he was confident his method would pay off. And finally, in February of 2005, 10 months after Copeland had taken over the case, he caught a massive break. He was back at Stephanie's apartment complex to conduct another round of interviews when a man came running towards him, calling out in a strong Czech accent. The man was one of the people who had told police early on that he had seen the peeping Tom by Stephanie's window. The man came up to Copeland and just started talking right away, sounding very excited. He said he had remembered something, and it was very important. In fact, the man couldn't believe it had taken this long for him to remember this. He told Copeland that when the peeping Tom had run away from Stephanie's window, he'd headed towards the apartment complex that was just on the other side of the woods. Copeland felt a rush. Police had searched those apartments early on, but nothing had come of it, and Copeland had spent the bulk of his time focused on Stephanie's complex. Now suddenly, he had a strong feeling that he would find what he was looking for just beyond the woods. Copeland thanked the man with the Czech accent for his help and then headed toward the neighboring apartment complex. When he got there, he went right into the management office and he asked one question of the people in that office. Were there any residents in their building who made a practice out of spying on other residents? The people in the office didn't even hesitate. They said absolutely there was one person who did do that, and they pointed Copeland toward that person's apartment. Copeland's time as a U.S. Marine had enabled him to remain calm in even the most stressful situations. But in this moment, as he walked towards this apartment, he could feel his heart beating faster and faster. Copeland was sure that talking to whoever lived in this apartment would finally break this case wide open. Copeland finally arrived at the apartment, and after taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. A moment later, the person who lived there answered, and they were clearly intimidated by how big Copeland was. But Copeland smiled, introduced himself, and showed his badge, and the person let him inside. Copeland didn't waste any time. He asked this person right off the bat if they knew anything about Stephanie Bennett's murder. And within minutes, Copeland knew the case had its first real suspect in years. After that meeting, Detective Copeland followed up on some of the information he had just gotten. Then he rushed back to the police station and told Lieutenant Morgan he was sure they had a lead that would finally pan out. Morgan felt a mix of relief and urgency. Detective Copeland, the garbage man, had come through just like Morgan had hoped. But Morgan knew they had to make sure they had enough evidence to convict their new suspect in court. Copeland had gathered a lot of information that day, and so with Morgan's help, they were able to secure warrants that would allow police to conduct surveillance on their suspect and to obtain a DNA sample without the suspect's cooperation. After visiting the apartments near Stephanie's, Copeland had been trying to secure a DNA sample from their new suspect. But this suspect had stayed one step ahead of Copeland. This man somehow knew he was being pursued, and he seemed to be a master at covering his tracks. When the suspect went to restaurants, he always ate finger foods, so he wouldn't leave prints on forks or knives. He also pocketed any straws he used, and he flushed his napkins down the toilet. At work, he wiped down his computer and desk every day, and he never disposed of anything in the trash can by his desk or in the dumpster outside the building. Detective Copeland knew the suspect was beating him, but he also knew the suspect's one small weakness. The man had a sweet tooth. The suspect's boss had told Copeland that the man often ate ice cream and other snacks at work, so Copeland had come up with a last-ditch effort to get a DNA sample. He had asked the suspect's boss to arrange a lunch for her entire department, and he had asked the boss to do something important at that lunch. So, on September 15th, 2005, almost 3.5 years after Stephanie's murder, 2 members of Copeland's team were dressed in plain clothes, sitting inside of a Golden Corral restaurant. The officers watched from across the restaurant as the suspect's boss walked up to the buffet line and grabbed a tray and put some banana pudding on it. The tray trembled in the boss's hands because she was so nervous, but she did the very important thing Copeland had asked her to do. She put that dessert tray right on the table in front of the suspect, and the suspect took the bait. They grabbed a banana pudding, and then he picked up a fork and began eating. After a few bites, the suspect wiped the fork down with a napkin and put the napkin in his pocket, but the suspect left the fork on the table. Minutes later, the suspect walked out of the restaurant, and at that point, the 2 plainclothes officers rushed over to the table and bagged the fork as evidence. And that fork would provide a DNA sample that would eventually allow police to determine who had killed Stephanie. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence found at the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Stephanie Bennett on the night of May 20th and the early morning of May 21st in 2002. The sun was shining bright when the killer walked from his apartment complex over to Stephanie's. He was carrying a duffel bag on his shoulder, he tucked his long hair under the hood of his black sweatshirt, and he kept his hands in his sweatshirt pocket so nobody would see the latex gloves he was wearing. The killer scanned the grounds to make sure nobody was nearby, and he saw that everything was clear. He'd chosen this time to come because he knew most people would still be at work and not out walking on the footpaths near the lake. The killer moved quickly towards the high bushes in front of Stephanie's roommate's bedroom window. He crouched down, climbed through the bushes, and then removed the window screen. The window itself was locked, but the killer knew it was not that secure. And so he grabbed the bottom of the window with his gloved hands, used all of his strength, and he forced it open. Once it was open, the killer climbed into the roommate's bedroom and closed the window behind him. He walked across the bedroom, opened the door halfway, and looked across the hall at Stephanie's room. The door was closed. Satisfied, the killer turned back around and went inside of one of the roommate's closets, and once he was inside, he positioned the door so it was barely open a crack so he could still listen to what was going on in the apartment, and then the killer put his bag on the closet floor, he sat down, and he waited for hours. Finally, at about 6 p.m., the killer heard the front door unlock and open. He held his breath. He knew he still had to wait just a bit longer. The killer heard the TV turn on in the living room, then he smelled food cooking in the kitchen, and he listened as Stephanie spoke on the phone. All the while, the killer just kept breathing slowly so he would stay calm and patient. Finally, hours after Stephanie had gotten home, the killer heard her coming down the hall. From his spot in the closet, he not only could see Stephanie walk into her bedroom, but he could see her in the bedroom. She left her bedroom door open. So the killer watched Stephanie as she got undressed and put on her nightgown. Then he saw Stephanie grab a book and get under her covers, and he waited while she read. Then the killer saw the light go off in Stephanie's bedroom, and he felt a jolt of adrenaline. It was time to go. The killer grabbed his bag, stepped out of the closet, and then placed the bag down right in the middle of the bedroom floor. Then he rushed out of the room, he went across the hall, he slammed open Stephanie's door, and he leapt onto the bed, pinning Stephanie down. Stephanie was in complete shock and terror. but the killer just pushed one hand over her mouth to keep her quiet, and he used the other hand to hit her multiple times. Stephanie was stunned and already bleeding. With one hand continuing to cover Stephanie's mouth, the killer pulled her off of her bed and dragged her across the hall into her roommate's bedroom where he had left the bag. Stephanie fought back and tried to break free, but the killer was so strong and he held her down and managed somehow to keep her totally silent. The killer dragged Stephanie into the center of the room, and then he reached over into his bag and took out several pieces of rope. And then using that rope, the killer quickly bound Stephanie's wrists behind her back, and then he pushed her onto the ground, and then he used the other piece of rope to bind her ankles, and then once she was all tied up, he removed all of her clothing, and then he shoved her underwear into her mouth to gag her. Then the killer left Stephanie on the floor of the roommate's bedroom, and then the killer crossed the hallway back into Stephanie's bedroom. And there, the killer went into Stephanie's dresser and looked through her clothes and eventually removed a piece of Stephanie's underwear. This would be his trophy. After that, the killer walked out of Stephanie's room, closed the door, and then went back into the room where Stephanie was bound and gagged on the ground. The killer placed his trophy inside of his bag and then turned his attention to Stephanie. The killer raped Stephanie. And then after he was done, he reached into his bag again and pulled out a long metal wire. He leaned over Stephanie, wrapped that wire around her neck, and slowly strangled her to death. After she was dead, the killer just stared at Stephanie's body for a whole minute. Then he threw the wire back into his bag and also cut the restraints off of her wrists and ankles and threw that rope back into the bag as well. Then the killer picked up the bag, climbed back out the window he had come in through, and ran across the dark apartment complex towards the woods. A few minutes later, he arrived at his apartment, he opened the door, and the second he did, he was greeted by his very friendly and extremely happy-looking black and brown Rottweiler. It would turn out that Stephanie's murderer was someone she had met before, but only very briefly. His name was Drew Planten, and he was the owner of that very happy-looking Rottweiler that Stephanie had noticed and gone up to and crouched down and pet after coming home from work about a month before her murder. And that was it. That was Stephanie's entire connection to Drew. But for Drew, that small chance encounter had been enough. And not long after that interaction, Drew had begun to stalk Stephanie and spy on her through her windows when she was in her bedroom. And finally, Drew had decided Stephanie would be his next murder victim. Because it would also turn out that Drew Planten had very likely killed before. Police would discover that years earlier, he had very likely murdered an exotic dancer in Lansing, Michigan, but the case had gone unsolved. However, everybody involved in that case fully believed Drew was the killer. Drew was not on Lieutenant Morgan and his team's radar at first because he had moved out of the apartment complex near Stephanie's not long after the murder, and he didn't really fit the description of the peeping Tom they had been given. He was tall, but he was gangly and had long, shaggy hair. Also, Drew was a well-respected chemist in Raleigh who did not seem to fit the initial criminal profile. But everything changed when the garbage man, Detective Copeland, took over. When Copeland learned that the killer had most likely lived in the apartment complex near Stephanie's, and that someone who Stephanie's neighbors didn't recognize had been watching the police from a distance, he had an idea. Copeland did not like to stereotype people, but as someone who'd grown up in the rural South, he believed every community had a busybody who made it their job to know everybody else's business. So he went to the apartment complex where he believed the killer lived, and he asked the office workers which resident spent the most of their time keeping tabs on their neighbors. And they immediately pointed him to one of the residents' apartments. But Copeland was not talking to the killer inside of that apartment. He was talking to a woman who regularly spied on her neighbors and who knew everything about all of them. And it turned out she was the person who had spent a lot of time lurking around the apartment complexes near the lake, watching the police investigation unfold. And that woman told Copeland he really needed to talk to Drew Planten, a man who used to live in an apartment close to hers and who had a pet Rottweiler. She said Drew had always creeped her out, but more importantly, she had seen him several times before the murder, hanging around near the apartment where Stephanie would be killed. And Copeland got confirmation from a few of Stephanie's neighbors, including the man with the heavy Czech accent, that they had often seen a man walking a Rottweiler around their apartment complex, and there was a chance that man could have been the peeping Tom they saw outside of Stephanie's window. So Copeland came to believe that Drew was very likely Stephanie's killer. Drew was able to elude police for a while, but eventually his love of sugar brought him down. Copeland knew nobody would eat banana pudding with their hands, so he set up his sting operation with Drew's boss, and sure enough, a partial DNA sample taken from the fork Drew used to eat the pudding showed that he was most likely Stephanie's killer. And that was enough to convince Drew's boss to continue helping the police, and she would ultimately secure a pair of gloves Drew had used at work before he could throw them away. And those gloves provided police with a more complete DNA sample that would be strong enough to hold up in court, and that did make it clear that Drew really had murdered Stephanie. In court, Drew Planton refused to walk, speak, or even open his eyes. He acted like he was in a totally catatonic state. But Drew was not catatonic, and ultimately he would commit suicide in jail before a verdict could be handed down. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One night in 2003, a man named Chris, who was living in Nashua, New Hampshire, drove from his house over to his girlfriend's house, which was only about 15 minutes away. On the drive over, he tried calling his girlfriend 3 different times, but she hadn't answered any of the calls, which was odd. When he pulled into her driveway, he saw her 2 dogs were outside in the yard, which meant his girlfriend had to be home. However, as he walked up the driveway toward the front steps of the house, he noticed the 2 dogs were acting very strange. They were walking in circles and whining with their tails tucked tightly between their back legs. Chris was about to turn and go check on the dogs when he looked up and saw the front door to the house was slightly ajar and the lights inside were all off. Suddenly feeling alarmed, Chris ran up the steps and entered his girlfriend's house, and what he would see inside would turn out to be one of the worst things Nashua, New Hampshire police had ever seen. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, when the Amazon Music follow button isn't looking, spill a significant amount of water in front of their dishwasher so they think it's broken and have to spend hours trying to figure out what's wrong with it. Okay, let's get into today's story. "43-year-old Jean Domenico was way too positive and upbeat of a person to complain about her life. In fact, optimism, kindness, and generosity, all those were just some of the words that family and friends used to describe Jean. And those qualities were so obvious in Jean's infectious smile, laughing blue eyes, and warm manner that even total strangers who exchanged just a few words with Jean always left those encounters knowing they'd met a very special kind of person. So, when Jean's coworkers passed by her desk at Oxford Health Plans on that hot New England morning in 2003, no one would have suspected that behind Jean's usual smile and cheerful greeting, Jean had been feeling anything but happy and calm. It was Wednesday, August 6th, and the day was shaping up to be one of the hottest on record in Nashua, New Hampshire, where Jean lived with her 2 teenage children. And when Jean had left her house at 7:45 a.m. that morning, she had spent the 30-minute drive to work going over and over in her mind the events of the last 5 days. Even inside of her air-conditioned car, where she felt comfortable and in control of her surroundings, Jean kept wondering if the decision she had come to on Monday, 2 days earlier, was the right decision, or whether it would just cause even more problems for her and her kids. As a single mom who had ended an abusive marriage 4 years earlier, Jean was no stranger to family drama and the strain of financial hardship, and Jean had always chosen to meet those challenges head-on. After leaving the children's father, Anthony Kazinskis, back in 1999, Jean began working 2 to 3 different jobs at once to put food on the table of their small home in one of Nashua's more modest neighborhoods. Even now, with her full-time job at Oxford Health Plans, Jean still worked a part-time shift at a local convenience store. But despite how busy she was, Jean's primary focus had always been her son, Charlie, now 14 years old, and her daughter, Nicole, who had just turned 16 2 months earlier. The three of them had always been very close, and now, aside from still sharing their father's last name, Charlie and Nicole spent almost all their time with their mom. And no matter how crazy her schedule was, Jean had always made sure that both children were well looked after when she was at work, and that the neighbors always kept an eye out for her ex-husband. Not only did Anthony owe Jean $11,000 in unpaid child support, but also Jean wanted to guard against the possibility that Anthony would show up unannounced and uninvited at the house when she was not there. But the turmoil Jean was feeling on this particular morning had nothing to do with Anthony or money or anything else that Jean felt like she could fix through hard work and good parenting, two things that came naturally to Jean. In fact, it had been Jean's efforts over the last 2 years to help guide Nicole through a difficult adolescence that had seemed to backfire in ways that Jean had just never expected. Driving along the familiar route to work, Jean thought back to Nicole just before she turned 14 and when their lives had seemed a lot simpler. While still in middle school, Nicole had been an outstanding student whose natural shyness had not stopped her from joining the school chorus and bubbling over at home with news about what she was doing and reading. And when Jean had heard other moms talk about the arguments or fights they had with their teenage daughters, Jean had just felt grateful that she and Nicole had always gotten along so well and had always enjoyed doing things and going places together. But when Nicole turned 14 and headed into high school, her shyness turned into awkwardness and intense self-consciousness about her weight and looks. Jean had been heartbroken the evening she found Nicole sitting on the bed in her tiny upstairs room using scissors to cut pictures of herself into pieces, and hearing Nicole describe herself as fat and ugly. After that, it wasn't long before Nicole, who had also dropped out of the school chorus, became the target of bullying. Driving along Interstate 293, Jean gripped the steering wheel more tightly, remembering one incident when a group of girls pulled Nicole's pants down to her ankles, leaving Nicole fully exposed from the waist down to laughter and stares from surrounding students. Jean had gone straight to the school principal when she heard about the incident, but that had not stopped the whispering and teasing. And then, just when Nicole seemed to be sinking into depression, the shy 14-year-old with low self-esteem had met 17-year-old Billy Sullivan in an online chat room. Billy lived 100 miles away in Willimantic, Connecticut, but the popular internet technology called Instant Messenger had allowed the two of them to form a close and personal relationship long before they actually ever met in person. And at first, it took Jean a while to connect the improvement in Nicole's mood and confidence to the increasing amount of time Nicole had started spending on the internet. And Jean certainly didn't know that within just 5 days of their virtual meeting, Billy and Nicole had already declared their undying love for one another. It was only when Jean's phone bill blew up with long-distance phone charges for calls from their home at 6 Dumaine Avenue in Nashua, New Hampshire, to a number more than 2 hours south in Connecticut that Jean realized that Nicole had found her first real boyfriend. But what Jean just could not have expected, given the physical distance between Nicole and Billy, was how seriously Nicole and Billy would begin to take their relationship. And when Jean had finally relented and agreed to drive Nicole to Connecticut so Nicole could actually meet Billy for the first time, Jean was certainly not prepared for how hysterical Nicole became when the 8-hour supervised visit ended and Nicole and Jean turned north and headed home to New Hampshire. On one hand, Jean knew that what she was seeing in Nicole was the kind of drama and intensity that only a teenager could bring to first love, and that eventually the relationship would probably play itself out, especially since Nicole had confided that Billy, for all his declarations of love for Nicole, had at least one other girlfriend, also Nicole's age. And when Nicole and Billy argued, Billy had let it drop that he'd been, quote, forced, his word, to seek comfort with that other girlfriend. On the other hand, Jean also knew that it was just not possible for her to control the feelings and actions of these two young people. And if all Jean did was say no to Nicole and point out flaws in her relationship with Billy, then chances were good that it would be Jean who Nicole would reject, not Billy. So, when Billy had arrived, unannounced and uninvited, at Jean's house that previous Friday, August 1st, Jean had not been pleased, but she had also, reluctantly, allowed him to stay. As Billy explained to Jean, he'd been given a vacation from his job as a line cook at the local McDonald's near his house in Willimantic, and since he'd also just recently gotten his driver's license and a car of his own, he'd wanted to surprise Nicole with an extended visit. Over the entire 15 months that the two had been together, they'd only actually seen one another in person 4 or 5 times, and never for more than just a few days. In agreeing to the visit, Jean had reasoned that at least this way, she would be able to keep a close eye on Nicole and Billy, who were not permitted to spend any time together alone in Nicole's upstairs bedroom. It had not been the most convenient arrangement in the world. Jean's house was a small but traditional cape house, a center front entrance that led into the living and dining rooms to either side, with the kitchen and 2 small bedrooms towards the back. Nicole's bedroom, with its sloped ceiling, was on the 2nd floor, along with an equally tiny bathroom, which meant that when Jean's 14-year-old son, Charlie, wasn't staying over with friends, as he often did, there was no spare bedroom for Billy, and Jean had to tiptoe around Billy, sleeping on the downstairs couch when she got up in the morning to start her day and tidy up the kitchen before leaving for one of her 2 jobs. It wasn't that Billy seemed like a bad kid. He had a steady job at McDonald's. He lived with his single mom and his 4 sisters, but he was not a freeloader. It was clear he loved his family and contributed a regular chunk of his hourly wages to help with household expenses. Tall and lanky, with a military-style buzz cut and dark brown eyes and a smattering of teenage pimples that made him look younger than he really was, he was generally polite and handsome. And Jean had to admit that Billy's frequent declarations about how beautiful and smart and talented Nicole was had, at least in the beginning, done a lot to improve her daughter's self-esteem. Still, Jean was glad the visit was coming to an end, several days sooner than Billy and Nicole had planned, so today was the last day that he and Nicole would have together before Billy returned to Willimantic. The last day, Jean would step outside and see Billy's black Chevrolet Cavalier sitting in their driveway. Just walking by the car that morning on her way to her own car, Jean had thought of that incident at dinner on Sunday, 3 days earlier. Wanting to make Billy feel welcome, Jean had spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen cooking a big dinner for all of them. Jean had been surprised when Billy had looked over the serving dishes and hot food that covered the table that evening and commented that it had been a while since he'd had a complete meal. When Jean had looked up from her plate, saying, "Really?" Billy had interpreted her comment as a veiled insult directed at Billy's own mother, as though Peg Sullivan were not as good a cook or as good of a mother as Jean herself was. Remembering the exchange now, Jean just shook her head. For her, Billy's hostile reaction had set the tone of the whole week, and now she was just glad the visit with Billy would soon be over. Determined to keep that fact uppermost in her thoughts, by the time Jean had arrived at work, she had regained most of her outward good cheer. She was scheduled to spend the day training a new employee, and that was something Jean enjoyed and looked forward to. She liked making sure that new hires felt comfortable and welcome and competent, and the training and orientation materials she'd be using were already neatly organized on Jean's work desk and computer. So, half an hour later, as Jean looked up to greet the new employee, it would have taken a very close observer to notice the faint lines of strain on Jean's otherwise open and smiling face. And throughout the day, that close observer did walk by Jean's desk several times to smile and say hello, but it wasn't until 4:30 on that Wednesday afternoon that Chris McGowan, Jean's fiancé and fellow Oxford Health Plans employee, stopped by long enough to have a real conversation with the woman he loved. Ever since Chris had met Jean on his first day of work 2 years ago, Chris had been completely smitten by this outgoing and friendly woman. A confirmed bachelor whose one long-term relationship had ended in the late 1980s, Chris had not been looking to date anyone, any more than Jean had been. By 2000, Chris, a stocky Irishman with dark hair and a wide smile under his dark mustache, had settled into a comfortable 3-bedroom ranch house as well as a comfortable routine. For her part, Jean was still recovering from her divorce the year before, and all her time and attention was focused on her kids and on paying the bills. And any spare time that she did have, Jean had spent it on activities like coaching Charlie's Little League baseball team or joining the parent-teacher organization when the children went to the Birch Hill Elementary School. But while that initial spark of attraction that Chris and Jean felt for one another had not lit an instantaneous bonfire, it had ignited something much longer lasting. Chris understood and respected Jean's devotion to her kids, and he was careful not to intrude on Charlie and Nicole's time with their mom. Even now, Chris rarely stayed over at Jean's house except on the weekends, and he was more than happy to wait until both Charlie and Nicole had graduated from high school and begun their own lives before he and Jean got married and lived together. To their respective family and friends, Jean and Chris formed that rare couple who seemed deeply and patiently in love with each other. Although they made a point of keeping their interactions at work very businesslike, Chris never tired of making small gestures that showed how much he cared for Jean, like the bouquet of roses he had delivered to her desk that past Monday. Despite how crowded the Domenico house was now with Billy visiting, Jean had asked Chris to spend as much time there as possible over the last 5 days. Chris got along well with both Charlie and Nicole, and Jean felt better about Nicole and Billy spending so much time together if Chris was also able to keep a watchful eye on both of them. So Chris knew firsthand the stresses Jean had felt that week, and he also knew that just when Jean felt like she really needed all her energy and stamina, she had experienced a few bouts of dizziness and fatigue over the last 2 days that were just not like her. Chris's first thought was that the dizziness had been the result of the highly restrictive diet that Jean had recently started in an effort to lose several pounds that had added a comfortable roundness to her 5'6" frame. And looking down at Jean now, at the end of yet another workday, he wished he could convince her that she was perfect just as she was, and find some way to erase the tiredness he could see in her eyes. Instead, Chris went over the plan they had agreed on for that evening. He would leave work now, head to his house, shower, check his mail, and do a few household chores, grab some clean clothes, and then meet Jean at 6 Main Street at about 7 or 7:30. That would give Jean plenty of time to stop and pick up the pizza she planned to serve for dinner that night and tidy up the house before Chris arrived. But it wasn't until the end of their conversation, when Chris whispered, "I love you," that Jean really switched out of work mode. Standing up suddenly, her eyes bright with affection, Jean put down her papers and pencil and reached up to give Chris a strong, warm hug. And Chris was still thinking about that hug and Jean's reply as he got into his car a few minutes later and headed south from the small town of Hooksett, where Oxford Health Plans was located, to the much larger city of Nashua, where Chris's house was located just a few miles away from Jean's. At times like this, Chris could understand the thrill of togetherness, whether you were a teenager or a middle-aged insurance broker. When Jean had said, "I love you too," Chris felt like he was the luckiest person in the world. True to his word, Chris arrived at Jean's house at 7:15. He'd called her 3 times since leaving his house at 7 to see if there was anything else she wanted him to pick up for dinner. When all 3 calls went to voicemail, Chris assumed that Jean must be out walking the family's 2 dogs, and so he stopped just long enough to grab a bottle of soda for the kids. But when Chris stepped out of his car, he could see both dogs still outside in the backyard of Jean's house. Thinking that Jean must have just gotten back from her walk, Chris made his way around to the front, he climbed the steps to the welcome mat, and then came to a sudden stop. The front door was slightly ajar, but inside no lights were on, and the house was eerily quiet. When Jean didn't answer his shouted greeting, "Are you in there, honey?" Chris pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. As he did so, it occurred to him that the dogs out back had been behaving strangely, whining and turning in circles, their tails tucked tightly between their back legs. His sense of alarm growing by the second, Chris was so focused on finding Jean that he did not even notice the smashed-up coffee table in the living room or the dark liquid that was splashed across the carpet. It was only when he stepped into the kitchen and his eyes followed the thin beam of light from the open refrigerator door as it slanted down to the linoleum tiles that Chris began to register the full horror of what was in front of him. Jean lay face down on the kitchen floor, her head and shoulders swimming in a thick pool of blood. A moment later, Chris was on his knees next to her, shaking her, gently at first, but then much harder, calling her name over and over again and begging her to please just wake up. When the Nashua Police Department and emergency medical personnel heard the call go out from dispatch reporting a, quote, sudden death in one of the city's quietest neighborhoods, it only took minutes for fire trucks, an ambulance, and police cruisers to pull up outside Jean Domenico's house at 6 Dumaine Avenue. With more than 90,000 residents, Nashua might be the second largest city in New Hampshire, but even in a state with one of the lowest homicide rates in the whole country, murder here in Nashua was very rare. So when Chris had called 911 and described a scene of blood everywhere when he discovered his girlfriend's lifeless body, law enforcement had mobilized all of its local resources, blocking off the entrance to Dumaine Avenue, even to residents, stringing up crime scene tape to hold back the growing crowd of concerned neighbors or curious spectators, and also making sure that Chris McGowan, dazed, disoriented, and covered in blood, did not take a single step without a police officer keeping close watch on him. Chris may have told the 911 dispatcher that it looked to him like Jean had had some sort of terrible accident, maybe fainting and hitting her head on a corner of the stove, but police did not have to wait for emergency medical personnel and later the medical examiner to tell them that this was no accident. In fact, it was just the opposite. Jean had been the victim of the most horrific attack that responding officers and detectives had ever seen. And since Chris was the person who had discovered Jean's body, and he was the boyfriend, always a person of interest in homicide cases, he had instantly become the #1 prime suspect, especially when he had no alibi for the time he claimed to have spent at home by himself after work and before finding Jean's body. As the first of Jean's neighbors began gathering outside to ask police what was happening, Chris was bundled into the back seat of a cruiser and driven to the Nashua Police Department headquarters, where he willingly gave police a DNA sample before being taken into an interrogation room for questioning. Meanwhile, over the next several hours, crime scene techs and law enforcement were able to gather a huge amount of information about what had happened earlier that afternoon and evening at the Domenico residence. Chris, along with neighbors who had a clear view of Jean's property, helped police establish that Jean had arrived home from work that afternoon at about 5:30 p.m., carrying boxes of pizza she had picked up from a restaurant called Chow's. Jean had missed her daughter Nicole and Billy by about an hour. The two teenagers had been spotted at 4:30 p.m. playing tag in the Domenico's big backyard before hopping into Billy's car and heading to a local 7-Eleven convenience store, where Billy's black Cavalier was later seen by an on-duty police officer who had also stopped at the same 7-Eleven. Both Nicole and Chris had called Jean's phone around 7 p.m. without getting an answer. Nicole had called because she wanted to tell her mom not to expect her and Billy for dinner. It was Billy's last day in Nashua, and he and Nicole wanted to spend the time alone. When Nicole had not been able to reach her mom, she'd left a message on Chris's phone letting him know that she and Billy would be going bowling and then shopping at the local mall. The unanswered calls that both Chris and Nicole had made to Jean suggested to law enforcement that by 7 p.m., Jean was most likely already dead. As for the crime scene itself, Jean's attacker seemed to have made very little effort to cover their tracks. Whoever had killed Jean had left behind a partial bloody handprint on the refrigerator, suggesting that they had not worn gloves and may have left other DNA traces inside of the house. Police were also able to determine the kinds of weapons that had been used to kill Jean, even finding a piece of one weapon in the kitchen sink and another weapon that the killer may have dropped outside. As for motives and suspects, initial interviews with Jean's neighbors had already turned up several possible leads. even though the neighbors gathering outside were all telling police the same thing, that Jean was genuinely and universally liked and even loved by her friends, coworkers, and acquaintances. It wasn't long before Nashua detectives Dennis Linehan and Richard Sprankle had added names other than Chris McGowan to their people of interest list. Neighbors immediately pointed to Jean's ex-husband, Anthony Kasinkas. Jean had said outright to several friends that she was afraid of him, and police would soon learn that Anthony had a criminal record for threatening a person by firing off a shotgun in their direction. And some neighbors even whispered that police should track down Jean's own son. Charlie had a reputation for hanging out with a bad group of kids and for such violent displays of temper that for a long time, Jean refused to keep any sharp knives in the house for fear that Charlie might attack her or his sister. Shocked by the violence of the scene, Detective Sprankle also wondered if the murder could possibly be related to gang violence, evidence of which had recently begun to surface in downtown Nashua, where certain walls and buildings had been covered with gang-related graffiti. And as Jean's children arrived at the scene, the feeling of shock and tragedy that now hung over the cozy Cape House just kept growing. Portable floodlights had turned the crime scene tape a neon yellow, and through the windows, Jean's neighbors could see the bulky shape of crime scene techs in protective clothing moving from one room to another. Charlie was the first of Jean's children to arrive. Emerging through the crowd outside his family home, he approached police, asking what was going on and where his mother and sister were. After being informed that his mother was dead, uniformed officers seated him inside of a cruiser and drove him to the police station where he waited for the arrival of his father, Anthony Kasinkas. As Jennifer Ballou watched the scene unfold from her house next door to Jean's, she felt her heart sink at the thought of Charlie's sister, Nicole. Nicole had babysat regularly for Jennifer, and the two had become close. Jennifer knew how difficult the last few years had been for Nicole, and even though Jean and Nicole had argued over Nicole's relationship with Billy, Jennifer also knew how much Nicole relied on and loved her mom. Already in a vulnerable place, Jennifer knew that Nicole's life was about to get much, much harder. By the time Nicole and Billy arrived at the house at about 10:15, Nashua police officers already had 4 suspects awaiting interrogation at the Nashua Police Department. They were also making room for a parade of neighbors who were there to give witness statements, each arriving in a separate police cruiser so no 2 witnesses could compare and possibly change their stories. It wasn't long before Nicole and Billy were also taken down to the station. With round, dark eyes, Nicole had stared at the house where she lived and where she had just been playing tag in the backyard 6 hours earlier. Nicole barely seemed to register Billy's quick kiss on her lips. A few minutes later, and she was sliding into the cool interior of a black and white cruiser headed to the Nashua police station 10 minutes to the south. After Nicole left, Billy remained at the scene with one of the police detectives. When Billy was young, his family's home had caught fire, and ever since then, as he told the investigator, he'd reacted with a lot of anxiety to the sound and sight of the flashing blue and red lights on emergency vehicles. Even though Billy did not know Nicole's family that well, as he and the detective chatted, Billy immediately agreed to help the police with their investigation, and by 10:30 p.m., he was happy to get away from the commotion and flashing lights at Nicole's house. He too was making the short trip south to a police station that now seemed to be overflowing with witnesses and suspects. For police detectives Linehan and Sprankle, it was a very busy night. Their main focus was on the interrogation of Jean's fiancé and her ex-husband, Anthony. Distracted and upset by the sight and feel of Jean's blood all over his bare arms, hands, and knees, as well as the patches of her blood that stained his shirt and shorts, Chris seemed to have a hard time concentrating on the questions, let alone accepting the fact that Jean had been murdered. Jean's ex-husband had given police permission to question Nicole and Charlie. Anthony himself was civil without being overly helpful. But once police had confirmed Anthony's alibi, they realized he did not seem to have any useful information anyway, and so from then on, he was present at the station only as the legal guardian of his 2 now motherless children. But even though investigators had ruled out Anthony as Jean's killer, they already knew they were making progress. Given the amount of physical evidence from the crime scene and leads from witness statements and their interview with Chris, they were confident that it would only be a matter of time and getting the forensics and autopsy reports before they identified Jean's killer. Still, they never expected that the breakthrough they were looking for would come so early in their investigation. And when the tip did come in, it came from a witness, not from a suspect. As Detective Linehan was out in the hallway looking for a larger room where Billy could wait for someone to take his statement, another detective, Mark Schaff, had noticed something interesting during the interview he was conducting with one of the witnesses. It was just a slip of paper, but it might be important. After describing his find to Detective Linehan, both investigators went still for just a moment. The air conditioning in the station was broken, and the heat from the day had been trapped inside, making everyone feel sticky and uncomfortable. Pulling his collar a bit looser, Detective Linehan decided this information was significant enough that he needed to follow up on it in person. By the time the sun rose 5 hours later on Thursday, August 7th, what the veteran detective was about to discover would become front-page headlines for weeks to come. Based on that conversation and follow-up interviews with other witnesses, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Jean Domenico on the evening of Wednesday, August 6th, 2003, inside her home at 6 Dumaine Avenue. After arriving home from work at about 5:30, Jean rolled right into her usual routine, letting the dogs out to do their business in the backyard, collecting and sorting the mail, checking phone messages, and tidying up the house. By the time she sat down to relax on the living room sofa, Jean was more than ready to spend a few minutes doing nothing more than enjoying the smell of pizza wafting up from the boxes on the kitchen table. After this past week, when the house had felt so crowded with people and teenage emotions, she welcomed the quiet before Chris and eventually Nicole, Billy, and Charlie arrived for dinner. So, when Jean heard the front door open a few minutes later, she looked at her watch in surprise. Chris would not be here for another hour, and it seemed early for the kids to be home, and Jean's surprise only intensified when she looked up and recognized her visitor. While Jean had been settling herself on the sofa, her killer had been cutting through the parking lot off Deerwood Drive behind Jean's house. Once Jean's backyard was in sight, the killer hesitated, but only for a moment. The plan was in motion, and there was no real doubts about what had to be done. By the time the killer had walked along the side of the backyard and cut across the front yard to the front steps, the killer felt committed and ready. Flinging open the door, the killer stepped inside. After saying hello to a startled Jean, the killer continued walking past her into Charlie's first-floor bedroom. Reaching behind the door of that bedroom, the killer pulled out an aluminum baseball bat. Closing the door, the killer then walked back out to the kitchen, where Jean was now standing next to the stove, a puzzled look on her face. Stepping toward the open entrance from the kitchen into the living room, the killer stopped and, turning to face Jean, lifted the bat and gave it an experimental swing. "I hate the Yankees," the killer said, referring to New York's Major League Baseball team. At this, Jean, who loved baseball, relaxed a little and went back to sitting on the couch and offering a few observations about recent sports news. It wasn't until the cordless phone on the small table next to the sofa rang and the killer immediately reached over Jean to answer it that time suddenly seemed to rush forward in a blur. After just a moment of listening to the conversation, Jean was raising her voice in anger. And as she turned to walk into the kitchen, thinking that any kind of movement might help her collect herself after recognizing the caller on the other end of the line, the killer suddenly lunged forward toward Jean. Then the killer swung the baseball bat in the direction of Jean's head. But instead of delivering a single blow that would stun Jean or crush her skull, the bat missed Jean's head. Instead, it hit her straight across her back and sent her staggering against the wall. Shocked and hurt, Jean righted herself and turned to look back, but even as she did so, her attacker swung the bat a second time. And this time, the bat hit Jean squarely on the back of her head, causing what the medical examiner would later describe as a large split in the bone of her skull. Still, not only did Jean stay on her feet, she fought back. A few seconds later, and the two of them had crashed onto the glass coffee table in the living room, snapping the wooden legs and showering the carpet with shattered glass. Despite her injuries, Jean would break free from her attacker 2 more times before her killer managed to dodge past her into the kitchen and grab a knife from the butcher block on Jean's counter. Rounding again on Jean, the killer struck. The first blow to Jean's upper right shoulder was so hard that the knife blade broke off from the wooden handle. Dropping the handle onto the floor, the killer reached again for the butcher block. Grabbing a second knife, the killer stabbed Jean twice in the throat before dropping that knife onto the kitchen floor. But as her attacker started to turn away, Jean picked the knife up and once again pushed herself to her feet. Shocked, her attacker watched as Jean tried to run towards them before slipping and falling in her own blood. As she fell, Jean's head bumped almost gently against her killer's side before hitting the plexiglass in the back door with enough force to push the panel completely out of its frame. Grabbing a third knife, Jean's killer straddled her fallen body and began stabbing, delivering more than a total of 40 blows to Jean's head, neck, back, arms, and hands before finally standing and looking down at her dark, blood-soaked hair and profile. Pausing before going into the bathroom to clean up, the killer listened as Jean struggled to breathe before speaking her final words. "Okay," she whispered, "I'm done." About 15 minutes after the killer had left the house, the back door at 6 Dumaine Avenue opened again. But this time, the visitor had to push hard enough to move Jean's body out of the way in order to enter the house. Once inside, the visitor looked down at the single mother of two lying in a pool of blood, and then very casually and carefully stepped over the body. Cleaning up the scene would be difficult, but the important thing was to avoid leaving footprints. So, picking their way through the splashes of blood that seemed to cover everything, not only the floors from the kitchen out through the living room, but also the walls and even the ceiling. The visitor was soon hard at work, scrubbing away handprints, gathering up the baseball bat and knives, and bundling everything, including bloody clothes the killer had left in the bathroom, inside a jacket. And then, straightening up and pushing her long dark hair out of her face, Jean Domenico's 16-year-old daughter, Nicole, gave a final look around the house. The smell of the pizzas on the kitchen table lost in the coppery scent of her mother's blood. Moving with the same care she had used coming into the house, Nicole once again stepped over her mother's body, and then, with a sigh of relief, Nicole closed the kitchen door behind her. Billy had done his part. He had kept his promise to Nicole that he would kill her mother so he and Nicole could be together for the rest of their lives, and now Nicole had done her part too. She had gone back to the house, cleaned up Billy's mess, and picked up the inhaler he needed to control his asthma. Earlier, when Billy had returned to the lot at the nearby 7-Eleven convenience store after killing Jean, Nicole had been waiting for him, reading a teen magazine she enjoyed while leaning against the hood of his black Chevy Cavalier. Nicole had been surprised by how much blood Billy still had on him, even after he had run upstairs before leaving the house to get a clean shirt out of the suitcase he had left in her bedroom. Nicole was also surprised at how angry and agitated Billy seemed. She'd known almost as soon as she called her home number, maybe 30 minutes earlier, and Billy had answered the phone, that her mother was still alive, because Nicole could hear her mother's voice in the background asking Billy if he was speaking to Nicole, and then hearing her mom plead directly with Nicole, asking her to please just come home. Nicole had had to shout at Billy to just do it, get it done, because how else would the two of them be able to start a life together unless Nicole's mother was dead? And Nicole had also known that her call to Billy had just made him upset. Still, it surprised her that once her mother was gone, that this reunion with Billy in the 7-Eleven parking lot wasn't more romantic and satisfying. And seeing all that blood on Billy, Nicole didn't really want to go back to the house, but Billy had made her, saying that cleaning up the murder scene had been Nicole's part of the bargain. It had been very hard stepping over her mother's body and not even being completely sure her mom was actually dead yet, but Nicole had done it. And then the two of them, Billy and Nicole, had driven to the Pheasant Lane Mall so Billy could clean up and get more clean clothes, and so they could get rid of the baseball bat, the knives, and those bloody clothes by dumping them at the deserted wooded edge of Overlook Golf Course located one town over. But once Nicole and Billy went back to the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, thinking they had committed the perfect crime and set up perfect alibis for themselves, everything started to fall apart. Nicole just had no way of knowing that later that night they would both be questioned by police and that some detective would notice the receipt for the new clothes Billy was wearing sticking out of Nicole's shirt pocket. And once that detective had started asking Nicole all kinds of questions about where she and Billy had been that afternoon and evening, it was impossible to keep all the lies straight. And soon the detective was talking to another detective who went and talked to Billy, and pretty soon the story Nicole told wasn't matching the story Billy was telling. And that's when Nicole just broke down in tears and told the detective everything that happened. Except that in Nicole's mind, even though it had been her idea to kill her mother, it was all Billy's fault because he was the one who actually did the killing. It would turn out that 3 days into Billy's visit to 6 Dumaine Avenue, Jean was so alarmed at the intensity of the relationship between Billy and Nicole that she told the two teenagers that Billy would need to end his visit early. She wanted him gone first thing in the morning on Thursday, August 7th. Jean also made it clear to Nicole that Jean was not interested in having Billy come visit again, or in letting Nicole go visit Billy. And after Billy's outburst at Jean during that family dinner on Sunday when Billy accused Jean of insulting Billy's mother, Jean had also begun to suspect that not only was Billy manipulating Nicole, he also had serious anger issues. What Jean had no way of knowing was just how correct those suspicions were. Ever since the age of 5, Billy had shown signs of depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder, a mental health condition that causes major mood swings. Billy had also been hospitalized at least 5 times for psychiatric problems, including an episode in which he had attacked his mother with a baseball bat. The agitation that police noticed in Billy when he and Nicole appeared at the crime scene on the night of August 6th may have been triggered by the bad memories he associated with flashing emergency lights, but it was also a physical symptom that indicated he was not taking the medications prescribed to treat his mental illness. In the 15 months since Nicole had met Billy online, Nicole and Billy had held a mock wedding ceremony, and by late 2002 had begun referring to one another as husband and wife and Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan. They also had both written letters to Jean asking that she allow Nicole to move to Connecticut and live with Billy. And when Jean said no, absolutely not, Nicole and Billy started talking about other ways to be together. Running away to another state, or getting Nicole a legal separation from her family. And even though Billy had at least one other girlfriend besides Nicole, he and Nicole made lists of what they would buy for their new apartment and life together. When Jean finally put her foot down and told Nicole and Billy on Monday, August 4th that they needed to end their relationship, the two teenagers would spend the next 3 days conspiring to kill Nicole's mother, the one person who stood between them and their dreams of the life they would spend together. In the early morning hours of August 6th, seated in separate interrogation rooms at the Nashville Police Department, Billy and Nicole each confessed to the brutal murder of Jean Domenico. In all, the life they had dreamed of together had lasted less than 5 hours, and the last time Billy and Nicole kissed or saw each other until their cases went to trial was just outside the house at 6 Dumaine Ave, where Jean's body would remain lying in its pool of drying blood until the next day. The news of Nicole's arrest stunned not only her family, but everyone who had known Jean. But that was not the last of Nicole's revelations. It would turn out that Nicole and her boyfriend had made 4 previous attempts on Jean's life in the days leading up to the murder. First, they had laced her coffee creamer with over-the-counter drugs and then with bleach. Neither attempt at poisoning worked. The drugs caused the episodes of dizziness that Chris would later blame on Jean's restrictive diet. The smell of bleach made Jean throw the creamer away without drinking any of it. The third murder attempt, starting a fire in Jean's bedroom and then locking Jean inside, failed when the flame-retardant mattress in Jean's bedroom would not catch fire. Their fourth attempt to kill Jean, by running a gasoline-soaked length of rope through an outside window into the oil tank and then setting the rope and eventually the oil inside the tank on fire, ended when Chris came out of the house and saw them. Panicking, Nicole threw the rope into a nearby garbage can. By Wednesday afternoon, August 5th, Billy and Nicole had decided to kill Jean with the baseball bat they knew was behind the door of Charlie's bedroom. They would create alibis with the story they told Chris about spending the dinner hour at the local bowling alley, and they also assumed the police would suspect that Jean was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. On March 28, 2005, almost 1.5 years after Jean's murder, Nicole avoided a charge of first-degree murder by pleading guilty to lesser charges of second-degree murder and agreeing to testify against the love of her life, Billy Sullivan. Nicole was sentenced to a minimum of 35 years in prison. 4 months later, on July 15th, after an unsuccessful attempt to plead guilty by reason of insanity, Billy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. After Jean's murder, Nicole's brother, Charlie, went to live with his father, Anthony Kasinkas. Birch Elementary School in Nashua, where Jean had once worked as a volunteer, member of the parent-teacher organization, and a teacher's aide, dedicated a granite bench in her honor that stands outside the school's entrance. On May 22, 2004, the city of Nashua renamed one of its Little League baseball fields the Jean Domenico Ballpark. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, when the Amazon Music follow button isn't looking, spill a significant amount of water in front of their dishwasher so they think it's broken and have to spend hours trying to figure out what's wrong with it. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At 6:45 a.m. on a regular Tuesday in Salt Lake City, Utah, a father and son lugged a heavy jewelry case into the lobby of a high-rise building. They ran a jewelry store together on the third floor, and they had come in early to set up their new display. They heard the lobby door open up behind them, and so they turned, and they saw a man holding a cardboard box. The man said he was making a delivery and asked them where the elevator was. The father and his son were heading towards the elevator anyways, so all three of them just got on the elevator together. As they stood in the elevator car as it brought them up, the father looked over at the box that the man was carrying. There was a name written on the top of it in black marker, but there was no return address, which seemed odd. And also, the man didn't really look like a delivery driver. He was wearing a green Letterman jacket like a high school athlete would wear. But the father just kept his thoughts to himself, and when the elevator doors opened to the third floor, he and his son carried their jewelry case out and went on with their day. But later that morning, a firefighter pounded on the jewelry shop door and said the building was being evacuated. The father and son rushed outside, where they saw fire trucks, police cars, and a crowd of other people who worked inside the building. As a woman in the crowd filled them in about what had just happened, a horrible realization dawned on the jewelry shop owner. That delivery man they saw on the elevator was not who he claimed to be, and the cardboard box he had contained something far more sinister than anything the shop owner could have imagined. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the follow button's office and break the lead tips off of all their pencils, and then hide their pencil sharpener. Okay, let's get into today's story. Monday, October 14th, 1985 was Columbus Day, and Steve Christensen was marking the holiday by chasing his three young sons around his big sunlit living room. His wife Terry stood next to the fireplace, smiling, with a hand on her very pregnant belly, and every time Steve looked over at her, he couldn't believe how beautiful she looked. She was absolutely glowing. Steve stopped running around to catch his breath. He was only 31 years old, but everyone said he seemed older, and today he felt older too. He was tall and broad-shouldered with thick brown hair and an air of seriousness about him. Steve's number one goal in life was to provide for his family, and he'd worked hard so they could have their nice home here in Salt Lake City, Utah. As his boys crowded around him, still wanting to play, Steve suddenly felt a pang of guilt. He knew he had not been spending enough time with his family lately because he had been so consumed with work. But Steve didn't feel like he had any other options. 2 months ago, the financial consulting company that he had helped build had gone under, leaving Steve almost bankrupt. Now he was trying to launch a new consulting business with a friend, and he was working overtime basically every week to get this new company off the ground. Steve told his sons they could play for a few more minutes, and so they did, and then afterwards he stood up and he walked over to Terry to rub her shoulders. He knew she was exhausted from the pregnancy and that she didn't like him working all the time, but Steve also knew he and his wife could make it through hard times. Not only did they have each other, but they also had their faith in the Mormon Church. Steve was a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as the Mormons are officially known, and Terry was a devoted member. Literally half the population of Salt Lake City was Mormon, and Steve loved it. He and his growing family were surrounded by a big supportive community. But Steve's interest in Mormonism went well beyond his faith. He also collected historic Mormon artifacts like letters, books, and other documents that cataloged the church's past. Before his financial problems began, Steve used to buy and sell these 19th century antiques all the time. He'd even donated rare historical documents to the church. These days, though, he mostly helped arrange document sales for other people. He'd recently helped his friend, Mark Hoffman, who was a professional antiques dealer, get a $185,000 USD loan to buy some early Mormon letters. Not only that, Steve had tracked down a lawyer whose client was interested in purchasing the letters from Mark at an even higher price. Steve, Mark, and the lawyer were going to meet tomorrow morning to make everything official. But Steve didn't want to think about business right now. He just wanted to enjoy this rare day off with his family. He kissed his wife's shoulder and went back to playing tag with his boys. The next morning, Steve's alarm went off at 7 a.m. He dragged himself out of bed, got ready for work, grabbed his briefcase, and headed to the kitchen. Terry was in there making waffles for the boys, and she asked if Steve wanted to sit down and eat, but he told her he didn't have time. He was just going to grab breakfast on his way to the office, and so he gave his wife and sons each a kiss before heading out the door. Steve drove his Jeep towards downtown Salt Lake City, stopping to buy a box of donuts and a couple of cans of ginger ale on the way. Then he parked his car outside a huge 8-story high-rise building called the Judge Building, where his office was located. The Judge Building was filled with other shops and offices, and even though it was only 8 a.m., there were already plenty of people milling around. Steve waved to some of the familiar faces as he strode toward the elevator. Steve took the elevator up to the 6th floor, and as he approached his office door, he noticed a cardboard box sitting on the ground. It sort of looked like a box that might contain a big cake, like a big square, and on top of this box, written in black marker, it just said, "To Steve Christensen." Steve balanced the 2 cans of ginger ale on top of the box of donuts, and then he carefully bent down and used his free hand to pick up this box. At that same moment, Steve's new business partner, Randy Rigby, was weaving through traffic trying to get downtown. Randy was about 10 minutes late for work, and he'd been trying to page Steve and let him know he was on the way. Steve was not answering. And as Randy approached the Judge Building, he was quite surprised to see all these fire trucks and police cars outside, parked everywhere with their lights flashing and sirens going off. People were gathered around the building, looking curious and concerned. Randy scanned the crowd for Steve, whose tall, broad frame was always easy to spot, but he couldn't see him anywhere. Then he started looking for Steve's Jeep and noticed it parked nearby. Randy walked up to a woman who obviously was from the Judge Building, and he asked her, what's going on here? And she said the whole building had just been evacuated because of some emergency. She said she had no idea what this emergency was. Suddenly, Randy had an unsettling thought. What if Steve didn't know that he needed to get out of the building and he was still in there? Randy needed to make sure Steve was okay. So even though he could see police officers shooing people away from the main entrance, he decided to sneak in. Randy drove his car to the back entrance of the building and quietly slipped inside.
He sprinted up 6 flights of stairs, burst into a long hallway, and looked at his and Steve's office door. Except there was no door. The entrance to their office was now a gaping hole framed by splintered wood and chunks of broken drywall. The hallway was littered with debris and coated in dust and ash. Randy's eyes looked to the floor, and he saw there were chunks of burned donuts and also 2 ginger ale cans that had been bust open. Then he saw his partner's mangled body lying amidst the wreckage. His business partner was so obviously dead that the emergency medical workers standing nearby weren't even trying to revive him. The scene was so horrible that Randy could barely process it. Staring at his lifeless friend, all he could think was, who's going to tell his wife? But then, a police officer grabbed Randy's arm and pulled him away from the area. He told Randy the building had been evacuated and he was not supposed to be here. Moments later, Salt Lake City police detectives Jim Bell and Ken Farnsworth reached the same hallway that Randy had just been kicked out of. The men made a good team. Bell was quiet and analytical, while Farnsworth was more talkative and outgoing. The veteran homicide investigators had worked a lot of cases together, but they'd never seen anything like this. Looking at the devastating scene, both detectives were at a loss for words. The victim, who they had learned was 31-year-old Steve Christensen, was unrecognizable. His chest had been blown open, his right foot was nearly severed off, and there were long, heavy nails lodged in his face. Farnsworth cleared his throat and said what both men were thinking. It looked like a bomb went off. The detectives put on gloves and spent the next hour combing the hallway and bagging potential evidence. They found a number of wires, a rocket igniter, and also a motion sensor switch, all items a person could use to build a homemade bomb. Just then, Detective Bell heard the elevator ding, and he turned and saw a scruffy man in a gray sports coat walk out. Jerry D'Elia was unique in the Salt Lake City Police Department. He was a prosecutor, he was also an arson expert, and he was an investigator. A native of New York City, D'Elia had more experience with bombing cases than anybody else on the force. Bell explained what they'd found so far, and D'Elia agreed that it seems like Steve had been the victim of a homemade bomb. But D'Elia said that whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing. Not only did they use a motion sensor switch so the bomb would go off whenever somebody moved it, but they had also wrapped the explosives in nails that virtually guaranteed the bomber's target would be killed in the explosion. In fact, D'Elia said the bomb was so sophisticated that he wondered if maybe this was the work of a professional hitman. But as they discussed the possibility that Steve was killed by a murderer for hire, another police officer came running up the stairwell, accompanied by 2 men who looked very shaken. The men said they owned a jewelry store on the 3rd floor of the Judge Building, and just that morning at about 6:45 a.m., they had rode the elevator up with a man who claimed to be delivering a package. And this man was carrying a cardboard box, and on the box it said, "To Steve Christensen." And so now that the jewelry shop owners had heard what happened, they were pretty certain they'd been inside the elevator with the bomber. Detective Bell asked if they recalled anything about the man's appearance, and the witnesses said he was Caucasian with brown hair, maybe in his 30s, and they remembered that he was wearing a green Letterman jacket. Bell looked over at D'Elia. A 30-something-year-old guy in a Letterman jacket didn't exactly sound like a professional hitman, because that kind of stands out quite a bit, and if you're a hitman, you want to be kind of under the radar. But then again, who was really to say what a real hitman looked like? Before they could talk it over, though, yet another police officer came barreling through the door from the stairwell, wide-eyed and breathing heavily, and he looked directly at Detective Bell and said, "We have another one." Shortly after 11 a.m., about 2 hours after this first explosion, Prosecutor D'Elia pulled up outside a home in the upscale Salt Lake City suburb of Holiday. He saw county sheriff's deputies, TV news reporters, and frightened neighbors crowded outside, all trying to make sense of the horrific scene. D'Elia parked his car, stepped out, and looked over at what was left of a nice brick house. An entire side of the garage had collapsed, and the carefully mowed yard was now covered with debris. D'Elia pushed through the crowd, and then he saw what everybody was staring at. There was a woman's body lying on the front porch. She had wavy gray hair, but her face was obscured by burns and soot, and her left arm had been blown off, and her abdomen had been ripped open. Delia didn't know this woman, but seeing her shattered body and destroyed home made him feel furious. Bombings were rare in Salt Lake City, and back-to-back bombings were basically unheard of. So Delia was quite certain that the same killer or killers were responsible for both. Delia approached one of the deputies who was already on scene and asked what they knew so far. The deputy told him that the victim's name was Kathleen Sheets. She was a 50-year-old schoolteacher and mother, and she was married to a financial consultant named Gary Sheets. Gary was the founder of that failed investment company where Steve Christensen used to work, and the men had a close professional relationship until about 2 months ago when their business went under. Then, the deputy showed Delia a piece of cardboard from the box that the bomb came in. There, in black marker on the cardboard, was Gary's name. Apparently, the deputy said, Gary was the bomb's intended target, not his wife. Delia thought this over. Two partners whose business recently failed had both been targeted by devastating bombs within hours of each other. Delia wondered if someone who had lost money when Steve and Gary's company collapsed might be out for revenge. But Delia also thought it was possible that maybe Gary killed his former business partner and his wife and only wrote his name on the box as a diversion. Either way, Delia knew exactly who investigators needed to speak to next. Later that morning, Detective Farnsworth sat in an interview room at the Salt Lake City police station across from Gary Sheets. Gary was in his 50s with white hair and even whiter teeth, but his eyes were red from crying. Farnsworth tried to be gentle while asking questions, and Gary was very forthcoming despite his obvious shock and grief. He explained that he and Steve used to run a financial consulting company together, working with wealthy investors. They'd done well until some bad investments left the company on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, 2 months ago, Steve had decided to leave and start his own consulting company with a new partner, leaving Gary to try to deal with the mess of their failed business. But Gary said he didn't have any animosity towards Steve, and he was heartbroken to hear about Steve's violent death. As for his own wife's murder, Gary said he couldn't believe any of this was real. Detective Farnsworth felt sorry for the guy and knew Gary should be with his family right now, but there was a bomber who was loose in Salt Lake City, and his questions just couldn't wait. He asked if Gary knew anyone who might want to hurt him. Gary paused for a moment and then said, well, yeah. When his and Steve's company failed, a lot of investors lost a lot of money. Maybe these bombs were a spurned investor's way of getting revenge. But if this was the case, Gary wondered, why target his wife? Detective Farnsworth swallowed hard and told Gary the bomb had actually been inside a cardboard box and his name had been written on the box. As far as police could tell, someone out there had actually wanted Gary dead, not his wife. Hearing this news, Gary began to cry, not only at the thought of his wife being murdered by mistake, but also because the reality that somebody was out to kill him was terrifying, and he began shaking like he was just so scared he couldn't help it. And so seeing this, Farnsworth immediately offered to place him in protective custody until the police solved the case. In the meantime, they needed Gary to put together a list of all the investors who'd lost money when his and Steve's company dissolved. Any one of them could be the bomber. While Detective Farnsworth wrapped up his conversation with Gary, his partner, Detective Bell, was a few miles away on the couch in Steve Christensen's living room. Steve's very pregnant wife, Terry, sat across from him looking totally numb. A few members of the family had come over as soon as they heard the news, and they took care of Steve and Terry's boys while she spoke with the detective. Her voice was flat as she told Detective Bell that she didn't know how she was going to live without her husband. Beyond the shock and grief of losing someone she loved so much, Terry was now going to have to find a way to support 4 children on her own, and the family's financial situation was not good. She sighed and sort of muttered under her breath that she wished Steve hadn't been so generous with the church. Detective Bell asked what she meant. Terry tucked a strand of her short blonde hair behind her ear and explained that Steve was always spending money on Mormon artifacts. The previous year, in 1984, he'd paid $40,000 for one document and then just handed it over to the church. Detective Bell looked confused. Terry explained that this document, called the Salamander Letter, was valuable because it was so controversial, raising doubts about the founding of the Mormon Church. The church taught that the founder of Mormonism was led to the Book of Mormon by an angel, but the letter said he'd actually been led there by a white salamander. Terry said that Steve's friend, Mark Hoffman, had found the salamander letter from one of his confidential sources, and when word got out that Mark had the letter, church leaders got really upset because it totally went against their teachings. Terry said she didn't want Steve to buy this letter, but he did it anyway. And then he donated the document to the Mormon church. And just like that, Steve and Terry's family had lost $40,000, money that they really needed right now. Detective Bell could see how upsetting this was for Terry. He didn't want to cause her any more grief, so he thanked her for the information and told her how sorry he was for her loss. But before he got up to leave, Terry stopped him. She said she felt like the salamander letter might have something to do with her husband's murder. The letter's discovery caused some Mormons to leave the church, and they might have blamed Steve for shattering their faith. Detective Bell wasn't sure what to think, but he promised Terry he would look into it. The next day, at about 2:40 p.m., Detective Farnsworth cruised down the highway towards the police station. It was only the second day of the investigation, but Farnsworth already felt enormous pressure to solve this case. People were scared, especially after a local reporter had received an anonymous call claiming there were 4 more bombs already planted all around Salt Lake City. And at a press conference the night before, the Salt Lake City police chief had said the crime could be related to this salamander letter. And so, fearing that their affiliation with the Mormon church could make them the next victims, multiple prominent Mormons had taken their wives and kids into hiding. Detective Farnsworth pulled into the police station, but just as he turned off the ignition, he heard an emergency report on the police radio. The dispatcher said all available police needed to head to an address near Main Street in downtown Salt Lake City. Just as the public feared, the bomber had struck a third time. Minutes later, Detective Farnsworth skidded to a stop near a blue Toyota sports car that was still smoldering. A firefighter sprayed water onto the smoking vehicle, and Farnsworth could hear the siren of an approaching ambulance just a few blocks away. Farnsworth jumped out of his car and saw that the entire driver's side of the blue Toyota had been blown apart, and a few feet away, a Salt Lake City police officer was kneeling on the ground, cradling an injured man's head. The man looked like a total wreck to Farnsworth. There were shards of glass in his face, his bloody right hand was missing a fingertip, and he had a piece of metal shrapnel sticking out of his right knee. But somehow, this man was alive. Just then, the sirens reached a fever pitch as the ambulance arrived on the scene. 2 EMTs jumped out of the vehicle and ran over to the injured man and began taking his vitals. Detective Farnsworth leaned down and asked the injured man for his name. In between labored breaths, he said his name was Mark Hoffman. Farnsworth immediately recognized that name. Mark was the man who had discovered the controversial salamander letter and sold it to Steve. But before the detective could ask any follow-up questions, the EMTs loaded Mark into the back of the ambulance and sped off to the hospital. Moments later, Prosecutor D'Elia and a federal agent who specialized in bombing cases arrived on the scene. The federal agent immediately began examining Mark's smoldering vehicle, while Farnsworth got D'Elia up to speed about the latest victim. But just then, the federal agent called out to them to come over and look at what he'd found inside of Mark's trunk. Farnsworth and D'Elia ran to the back of the sports car, and in the trunk they saw a trove of old-looking papers that had been damaged in the explosion. They were either burnt from the fire or sopping wet from when the firefighter had doused the vehicle with water, but they were all there and clearly seemed pretty important. As he looked at the ruined papers, Detective Farnsworth was overwhelmed with questions. Why would someone want to kill Mark Hoffman? Could it be related to the documents inside his trunk? Or could it be someone who blamed Mark and Steve for unearthing the salamander letter that undermined the Mormon faith? And if that was the case, why would the bomber then also target Gary and Kathy Sheets? They were connected to Steve, but they had nothing to do with the buying and selling of Mormon artifacts, and so none of it made any sense. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, Detective Bell stood in Mark Hoffman's room at the LDS Church Hospital. Mark had all these open wounds on his face from where doctors had pulled glass out, and he was waiting for an operation on his injured leg. Bell felt terrible for him, but on the bright side, doctors said he was likely going to live. Mark was on pain medication, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Detective Bell asked him if he felt well enough to talk, and Mark croaked out a yes. The detective asked Mark where he was going when the explosion happened, and Mark said he was on his way to sell some rare documents to a lawyer downtown. Bell asked what kind of documents, and Mark sort of paused for a minute and then said he couldn't actually remember. He said he couldn't actually recall much of anything from that morning, except opening his car door and seeing a small package fall out. Mark said he went to pick up the package, and then everything went black. Detective Bell nodded grimly. He'd heard from people in the Mormon community that Mark was this incredibly talented and charismatic man. Mark was jokingly known as the Mormon Indiana Jones because he was so good at finding valuable artifacts. So to Bell, even though he didn't know Mark, it just seemed so sad that this guy was kind of a shell of himself with virtually no memory of what nearly killed him. Bell asked Mark if he could recall anything from before the explosion. Mark thought for a moment, and then he whispered that he had noticed a brown pickup truck that seemed like it was following him right before the explosion. The truck didn't worry him at the time, but only now, as he thought about it, he wondered if the bomber might have been trailing him. He'd seen through the mirror that the driver was a white man with brown hair, but besides that, Mark didn't get a good look at the guy because, again, it didn't really matter to him at the time. Detective Bell nodded. It sounded like the driver could be the same person the father and son saw in the Judge building. But still, there was a lot of white men with brown hair in Salt Lake City, Utah, so this was not a particularly helpful clue. Just then, a doctor came into the room and said they needed to begin prepping Mark for his leg surgery. Detective Bell thanked Mark for the information and then turned to leave. Two days later, on Friday, October 18th, Bell and Farnsworth sat inside of an interview room facing a man named Shannon Flynn. The detectives had learned that Shannon was Mark Hoffman's full-time employee, helping him find and sell these rare documents. And so if anybody could help investigators understand what was going on in this strange and secretive world of trading Mormon artifacts, it was Shannon. Sitting at the table, Shannon seemed very nervous. But then again, so far 3 bombs had gone off in Salt Lake City, targeting Shannon's boss and another man he routinely worked with, Steve. Shannon admitted that he was terrified of becoming the bomber's next victim. Detective Bell asked Shannon if there was any particular person he felt afraid of, but Shannon shook his head and said no. He told them that a lot of these document sales happened anonymously through people's lawyers or other representatives, so this made the whole situation even more frightening. Somebody could have it out for him, and he wouldn't even know their name. Bell asked if Shannon knew anybody who might want to hurt his boss, Mark, and Shannon said that Mark was having financial trouble related to 2 different document sales. Either one could have made Mark some enemies. Shannon said for the first deal, Mark had asked his friend Steve Christensen for help getting a private $185,000 loan to purchase a collection of antique documents. And now, Mark was having trouble paying back that loan, which had very much upset Steve. But Mark kept telling Steve not to worry because he had an even bigger sale pending. And when that went through, Mark promised he could pay back the loan then. But Shannon said Mark's second document sale had also hit a snag. Mark had acquired the only known copy of the first document ever printed in colonial America, known as the Oath of a Freeman, a discovery so significant that the United States Library of Congress had offered to buy it for $1 million. But the Library of Congress wanted elaborate proof that this document was indeed authentic before they paid such a huge amount for it. And so this delay in the sale was really putting Mark in a very serious cash crunch. Detective Bell asked Shannon if he knew where Mark got the document, but Shannon said no, Mark didn't share the names of his contacts very often. At this point, the detective was starting to feel suspicious of Shannon. It was hard to believe that as Mark's only full-time employee, he didn't know anything about where these documents were coming from. Plus, Detective Bell didn't understand why Mark would have needed a loan to buy artifacts. He knew Mark had made hundreds of thousands of dollars selling antiques, so Detective Bell outright asked Shannon if he knew where all of his money had gone. Shannon suddenly looked down at the table and sort of mumbled that Mark lived far beyond his means. He traveled all the time, lived in a huge house, and drove an expensive sports car. Plus, Mark could be generous almost to a fault. Shannon said that one time Mark had given him money to buy a submachine gun for his firearm collection, and then he also helped pay to convert that submachine gun into a fully automatic gun. When Detective Bell heard this, he tried to keep his expression neutral, but he was shocked. Shannon had just confessed to turning a gun into a fully automatic weapon, which was illegal. Detective Bell glanced at Farnsworth, and he looked just as surprised. Bell quietly asked Farnsworth to step into the hall with him. Once they were out there and out of earshot of Shannon, they both agreed that Shannon seemed very suspicious, and because he confessed to owning an illegal firearm, they had probable cause to arrest him and search his home. So that's exactly what the detectives did. Shannon was immediately taken into custody on the firearms charge, and when Bell and Farnsworth searched his home, they found at least 3 more guns. Then they stumbled on something even more shocking. Shannon owned a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook, a notorious 1970s book that contained instructions for building bombs. Just like that, Shannon shot to the top of their suspects list, and they quickly got another warrant to search more of Shannon's property. It turned out Shannon rented a storage unit, and police suspected that might be where he was constructing bombs. That weekend, Detective Bell arrived at what investigators called the War Room, a big conference room in the Salt Lake City police station where everyone working the case could meet and discuss their progress. Bell sat down with Farnsworth, Prosecutor D'Elia, and the federal agent from the 3rd bombing scene, as well as a number of other law enforcement officials. And they had a lot to talk about. Even though the search of Shannon Flynn's storage unit hadn't revealed anything incriminating, he still seemed extremely suspicious. If the police were right, and these bombings were all related to the rare document trade, then Shannon seemed like their only real suspect. But Detective Bell knew that this explanation did not account for the murder of Kathy Sheets. As far as police could tell, Kathy and Gary Sheets had not been involved in buying or selling Mormon documents and had nothing to do with Shannon Flynn. So, Prosecutor D'Elia suggested the investigators go back through the dozens of interviews they'd conducted. Maybe if they reviewed all of the evidence as a group, something would stand out. And so Bell and Farnsworth just began reading their notes out loud, going through every last detail from each person they'd spoken to, and as they did this, suddenly, the federal agent's hand shot up, and he told them to stop. The agent said he just noticed something. A detail from one of the interviews didn't make sense. One of their witnesses had to be lying, and he felt certain this person who was lying was the bomber. Immediately, investigators started drafting a court motion to get one more search warrant. And during the search, just a few days later, they uncovered a piece of evidence that broke the case wide open and led to a shocking revelation that nobody imagined. Based on the evidence found during police searches, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened during the Salt Lake City bombings of 1985. Late on the night of October 14th, the killer stood at a work table in their basement, putting the finishing touches on 2 homemade bombs. They'd spent the last few weeks researching how to build them, and they felt confident the design would work. The killer taped dozens of long carpenter's nails over one bomb and added extra explosive powder to the second, making both bombs extra lethal. Then they gently placed each bomb into separate cardboard boxes. The killer had already used an ice pick to carve 2 small holes into the bottom of both boxes. Now they carefully threaded the wires from the motion sensor switches in each bomb through these holes. They taped the wires to the outside of the box to keep them separated, and when the time was right, they would connect the wires, activating the motion sensor switch inside that would make the bombs detonate. Satisfied, the killer turned the cardboard boxes back over and taped them closed. They then grabbed a black felt tip marker and wrote on the first box, "To Steve Christensen," and on the second box they wrote, "To Gary Sheets." Finally, the killer padded upstairs and got into bed, satisfied that everything was ready. The next morning, the bomber woke up before sunrise. They slipped out of bed, tiptoed to the basement, and carried each box outside to the car. It was chilly, so they ran back in and put on their old green Letterman jacket. Then they got into the car and drove downtown to Salt Lake City. At about 6:45 a.m., the killer parked outside the judge building, got out of their car, and lifted the box labeled "To Steve Christensen" out of the back seat. They hoped to slip in and out of the building without being seen, but the moment they walked into the lobby, they ran into 2 people, a father and son. The bomber pretended to be a delivery driver and got into the elevator with these 2 men. These men got out on the 3rd floor, and when the killer reached the 6th floor hallway, they found their way to the office door that had Steve Christensen and Randy Rigby's names written on it. There, the killer knelt down, turned the box over, and carefully connected the 2 wires on the bottom, activating the motion sensor switch inside the bomb. Then they very carefully set the box right side up. Then they casually turned, walked to the stairwell, headed downstairs, outside to their car, and drove away from the judge building. About 15 minutes later, the bomber arrived outside of a big brick home in the suburban city of Holiday. They didn't see any cars parked outside, so they assumed the home's owner, Gary Sheets, had left and would be home later that afternoon. The bomber walked up to the front door carrying the cardboard box, then they taped the motion sensor wires together and gently placed the bomb near Gary's front porch. After that, the killer turned, walked back to their car, and drove home. When they got there, they opened up the front door, and the house was quiet. So they slipped back into bed without being noticed by anybody else inside. But once the bomber got out of bed, they couldn't resist the urge to turn on the morning news. And at about 8:30 a.m., while they were sipping coffee on the couch, the news broke. A bomb had gone off at the Judge Building, and a man had been killed. The killer pretended to be just as shocked as anybody else in the house was. They even called into work and canceled meetings that day so they could stay home to be safe. Then, less than 2 hours later, local news stations reported the second bombing. But as the killer watched the coverage of this second bombing, they realized their plan had not gone as smoothly as they'd thought. They'd meant to kill Gary Sheets, but the news report said the second victim was a woman. And things got even worse that evening when the Salt Lake City police chief gave a press conference. The killer watched as the police chief said the bombings might be related to a controversial Mormon document called the Salamander Letter. The killer's stomach sank. They couldn't believe the police had zeroed in on the real reason for the bombings so quickly. They had to find some way to get investigators off the trail, and the only way they could think to do that was to create even more chaos. So, late that night, the killer crept down to the basement and constructed a third bomb. The next afternoon, on October 16th, the killer put the bomb in the passenger seat of their car and drove to a busy area downtown. They parked, got out, and then leaned back into the car to turn the bomb over in the passenger seat. They attached the two wires on the bottom of the box, activating the motion sensor switch inside. Then, as they went to take the box out of the car, they jostled it just a bit too hard, and the bomb detonated, sending the killer flying. They crashed into the pavement with shrapnel stuck in their legs and face. They were missing a fingertip, and they were barely breathing. At about 4 p.m. on Wednesday, October 16th, when Detective Bell went to the hospital to interview Mark, he had a lot of questions about how the explosion happened. Mark said he opened his car door and a small package had fallen out, then exploded. But later, when Detective Bell read his notes from this interview aloud to fellow investigators, the federal agent said Mark's story did not line up with the physical evidence. The pattern of damage inside of Mark's car showed the bomb was somewhere near the center console when it detonated, not anywhere close to the driver's side floorboard like Mark had claimed. Now they had caught Mark in what looked like a lie. It was enough for the police to get a warrant to search his home, and there, shoved in the back of a closet, they found a green Letterman jacket, just like the one the bomber wore. But that was far from the most damning evidence. Police also discovered 2 locked rooms in Mark's home, which his wife never entered. The rooms were filled with stacks of old-looking papers, inks, and chemicals. Detectives didn't know what to make of all this until they found a receipt from a local engraving company. The owner of the company told them that Mark had ordered a special engraving plate that would allow him to recreate a famous historical document called the Oath of a Freeman. The same document Mark was trying to sell as authentic to the Library of Congress for $1 million. The detectives soon put 2 and 2 together. Mark Hoffman did not have secret sources who provided him with rare and valuable artifacts. Instead, he'd been forging documents the entire time, which was why he wouldn't tell his employee, Shannon Flynn, where he was getting them from. As for why Mark did all this, money was his most obvious motive. He'd made hundreds of thousands of dollars by forging documents, but he also had another aim. He wanted to embarrass the Mormon church he'd grown up in. Although Mark pretended to be a devout Mormon, he'd stopped believing in the church's doctrines when he was a teenager. As an adult, he started forging papers that would undermine the church's history and shake other people's faith too. The Salamander Letter was totally fake, but it did embarrass church leaders by making it look like Mormonism was inspired by a salamander rather than an angel. And Mark's friend, Steve, had paid him $40,000 for it, believing it was real. Then, in the months leading up to the bombings, Mark had persuaded Steve to arrange a big $185,000 loan to buy a collection of Mormon letters that did not even exist. Mark took the money from Steve and squandered it on fancy vacations and a sports car, and then couldn't repay the loan. So, to get out of this financial hole, Mark forged a copy of the historic Oath of a Freeman that he planned to sell to the Library of Congress for $1 million. But after Mark gave this fake document to library officials to verify, weeks ticked by with no word from them, and he got nervous that experts had found a flaw in his forgery and his whole scheme would fall apart. And at the same time, Mark's friend, Steve, was getting very impatient with Mark for not repaying his $185,000 overdue loan. And so at this point, Mark decided his only option was violence. He murdered Steve to get him off of his back, and then planted a bomb at Gary Sheets' house as a diversion. In reality, Mark didn't care whether Gary lived or died. He just wanted police to think that the bombings were all related to Steve and Gary's failed financial consulting business. And the plan almost worked until Mark made the mistake of setting off a bomb in his own car. He later claimed he did this on purpose in an attempt to commit suicide, but investigators believed Mark actually intended to use this bomb either to kill Shannon Flynn, who was talking to police about Mark's financial problems, or to cause such a scene in downtown Salt Lake City that it would throw the detectives off his trail. Officers arrested Mark Hoffman in January of 1986, and he quickly confessed to both the forgeries and the bombings, but he expressed no remorse for what he'd done. Mark then pleaded guilty in exchange for a life sentence rather than facing the death penalty. Once he was in prison, Mark's wife divorced him, and he was excommunicated from the Mormon Church. Mark later attempted suicide, but he would survive. However, he would permanently damage his right arm, ironically losing control of the hand he'd once used to commit his many forgeries. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you.